chased down a road in Jeff Davis County and shot to death.
That's a god-awful thing.
Who would kill a woman in such a horrific way?
Just by the bed.
It was a lock of hair.
Couldn't have her. He had her hair.
She told him how to sit, when to sit, where to sit.
It was like she was talking to a dog.
She was the third wheel, she was the fifth wheel, she was pretty much every wheel.
I have walked up on them, open mouth kissing.
Instead of just going to bed in our bed, he'd go to bed in her bed.
I'm sorry, it was furthest from natural.
Sick, twisted people. You were more than mother and son.
That's nasty. Like his mama.
My name is Gary Orvin. My daughter just called me. She was like, "Oh my God, Daddy, I think somebody's shooting at me."
Where's your daughter?
I kept asking her where she was, but the call went dead.
Gary Orvin called 911. His daughter Nikki's being chased on the highway, being shot at.
He's panicked. She's in danger.
You never really prepare for this type of call.
All her father knows is the car she has is a silver sedan.
And that she would be driving on Highway 221. You got to find where they're at quickly.
They think she was probably somewhere between Uvalde and Hazelhurst, her home.
In a rural area, there's no street lights. You have to locate a vehicle by actively searching and hoping they have their headlights on.
But it's not but about a mile from the river towards Uvalde. Police find a car fitting the description pulled off to the side of the road. The deputy approaches the vehicle. He sees a female in the car.
Her left foot is outside the vehicle. She was leaned over the console, and the cell phone was in her right hand.
He sees blood. This is not good.
She was, at that point, deceased.
There's a name tag on the victim confirming that it is 28-year-old Nikki Orvin. Here's a young, defenseless woman slain brutally on the side of a highway.
The first gunshot wound, which appears extremely bad, is to the facial area. It come in from her left side and exited through the right. You have aspirated blood on the dashboard, which means she was breathing at the time. Then there was a secondary wound, also to the left side, in the neck area. To see somebody in the prime of life deceased, that's a god-awful thing.
There's no other vehicles around. There's no weapon to be found. Was this a random act of violence or a targeted attack?
Does she have children? Is she married? Does she have a family? As with any homicide, the whodunit comes into play.
I got a phone call from my mother. Said Nikki had been in an accident. At that point, I thought she had just been in a car accident. I drove to the highway. I see all the cop car lights and the ambulance lights flashing. Cop come out, waving me down, and I holler at him. That's my sister in an accident. I need to see what's going on. He said, there is no easy way to tell you this. Your sister's dead. I remember I fell to my knees on the asphalt. Right there on that road that night. I know part of me left. Nikki's name is actually Allison Nicole Orvin, but she went by Nikki. My dad's Gary. I am the oldest brother. Nikki is my only sister, and we were born on the same day, 3 years apart. It was fun growing up in the country. I enjoyed hunting, riding motorcycles. We were very close growing up.
The red hair. They say the red hair is the giveaway. And apparently my mother had flat feet. I'm real flat-footed, so there's that. From what I can remember, I feel like she was a very caring woman to me and my brother, Elijah. I didn't know what to think of any of it. I was too young to understand what was going on.
We couldn't think of anybody that would want to kill her.
As a chief investigator, this is the most unique case I've ever worked. The people here are hardworking, God-fearing people, not involved in criminal activity. You get on a crime scene. It's a humongous puzzle, many pieces. We have to start putting them back together. Immediately, you notice that the back window has been shot, and there was a 4-inch gash on the roof of the vehicle.
Looking at the car, officers found the right headrest on the passenger side of the car. The bullet had actually traveled through that headrest.
And when you have that amount of spread, it suggests distance. But we started walking back from the vehicle, and lo and behold, beside the road, we have located a couple of shell casings, a .45 caliber, which means somebody was shooting at her going down the road. However, there's also one .45 caliber casing outside the vehicle and one inside the vehicle. So somebody was also shooting at her just outside the door.
Officers searched around the area and noticed something else.
We found a footprint outside the vehicle.
That was extremely important information to us. They take photographs and do an imprint and take that in as evidence.
Everything suggests this young mother was chased down the highway, eventually being ran off the road and shot in cold blood at close range.
It's extremely personal to shoot someone within 2 to 3 feet of their head. You have to come basically face to face with them.
This was a targeted execution.
It makes your mind explode.
Allison Bamberg chased down a road in Jeff Davis County and shot to death.
One of the things you do in most homicide investigations, especially with women, is to look for lovers, husbands, personal relationships.
Information came to the officers that Nikki had just finalized a divorce. She was murdered on Friday. Their divorce was just 4 days earlier.
Obviously, police want to talk to her ex-husband. That's when things get really weird. Out of the blue, they get a call from a neighboring sheriff's department.
The crime scene is Jeff Davis County. Nikki was coming from Montgomery County. We knew that from a phone call with her father.
And who's there in Montgomery County reporting that his hand has been injured by Nikki, her ex-husband, Damon Bamber.
What's going on here? Nikki's ex-husband is 18 miles away in a neighboring county filing a report against her.
Such a unique set of circumstances.
He's right in front of them. They have to break the news that his ex-wife had been killed. But he doesn't quite seem to be taking the news in. It's kind of strange.
And then outside, the deputy notices that there's 2 children in the back of Damon's vehicle.
There's also someone else, Damon's mother, Sonia Bamber. According to them, their sole reason for being there is to report that Damon's ex-wife, Nikki, had injured his hand during the exchange of children.
Damon says Nikki rolled down the window and pinched his hand. He got some ice and then went straight to the sheriff's office to file a complaint of assault.
Damon says he hasn't seen Nikki since the convenience store and went straight to the sheriff's office with his children and his mother, Sonia.
And, of course, Sonia was there to verify. He's obviously telling you the truth because that's what I seen.
But law enforcement wanted to interview someone else, Gabriel. He was the 6-year-old young son in the back seat.
Gabriel was old enough, been an eyewitness. Could he describe the events as they transpire?
I remember being in a room talking with a detective. I didn't know what to say because I didn't even know what was going on.
I was wondering if you would be open to listening to some of this recording that I have.
Yes, I want to, yes. Yeah, I didn't know there was one.
So, do you sit in the back of the car when you're with your daddy? Does he have a car or a truck?
A car. Mommy has a silver car.
Whose car were you in?
Daddy's.
Did you see Mommy in her car after y'all left the store?
No. She went this way, and we went that way.
So when you leave the store, she goes one way and y'all go another way?
Yeah.
My mother went one way, we went another. That's exactly what Sonia and Damon had claimed. We cannot make sense of the situation here. And so Montgomery County released Damon and Sonia from the sheriff's office and allowed them to go home.
Nikki met Damon working at a Walmart. I think Nikki probably liked that Damon was a big guy, felt protected by him. She thought he'd be a good provider. Nikki had Gabriel with her first marriage, and then she stayed single until she met Damon. As soon as they got married, couldn't have been more than a month or 2, she was pregnant, and Elijah was born. Nikki was a good mom. Her life revolved around her kids.
don't think I've ever seen this one. I just remember growing up, my name was suddenly Bamberg. I remember with Damon, we would go outside and throw the ball around or maybe play a board game inside.
Damon did adopt Gabriel, and I thought, well, this is a real stand-up guy. I had no reason to think otherwise.
You know, I was very young, but from what I can remember, Damon could really be a tough, mean character sometimes. The discipline was different.
We later found out he was just very mean to Gabriel. He was always getting on to him for punishments, making him do weird, difficult things that a very small 3-year-old child should not be doing. Stand in a corner, hold books in each hand and hold your arms out to your side and don't drop them down.
As a kid, you don't understand things, and you don't see them for what they actually are.
I believe Damon had a very bad temper on him. I told Nikki she shouldn't be letting anything like that happen to Gabriel that she didn't want to be happening to him. But I think at the time she was too scared to do anything about it.
During the course of the investigation, they're checking things like, does Damon have a criminal history?
So investigators file a subpoena with Nikki's divorce attorneys looking for any type of documents that could be relevant to this case. That's when they discover something alarming.
One time, Nikki was visiting a friend of hers from high school. Damon was jealous of her friendship, so he comes over the house, extremely upset. Nikki went out to talk to him, you know, what's going on. He was extremely angry with her. He took a knife and threw it at their feet.
The police were called for the threats that Damon made towards my sister. He threatened her multiple times, verbally, physically.
We had reports from other agencies. At one point, law enforcement had to threaten to shoot Damon to keep them separated.
We find out after this incident, she left him and moved into a women's shelter with the kids and filed divorce proceedings.
She was filing the paperwork to get divorced. He was telling her all the time, I'm gonna get custody of the kids. The kids are mine. They're not yours, they're mine. Nikki was genuinely scared.
Now, the police now know Damon has a violent nature. He is hot-headed, reacts, and he doesn't mind using a weapon. But just because he's been violent before doesn't mean that he committed this crime.
Damon lived with Sonia, which a lot of my side of the family, they thought it was weird.
She was a little overbearing towards Damon. She told him how to sit, when to sit, where to sit. He did what she asked, when she asked.
I was dating Damon Bamberg at the time of the murder. I met Damon online. We started talking on the phone, and then we met in person, and his mother was there. I was very shocked. It's not really something you do when you first meet somebody. We would make plans, and Damon would reply, well, we have to see what the mother person wants to do. She was the third wheel, she was the fifth wheel, she was pretty much every wheel you can think of.
anytime Damon had a woman in his life, his mom seemed to be part of the deal.
My name's Andrea Mainwaring, and I was Damon's first wife. When Damon was around his mother, Sonia, he went to doing whatever Mommy said to do. She would start having outbursts if she wasn't getting her way, and Damon was happy to do anything to appease his mom.
When Sonia and Damon were around, you could tell something was definitely different. Just strange.
It was very weird. It was like their dynamic was way too close.
Nikki told me of instances of when she would walk in, you could tell a sudden separation.
They had no boundaries with each other.
When Nikki left Damon, she finally decided to air it out. That's when Nikki told me that Damon and Sonia were more than mother and son.
After the murder of Nikki, we released Damon and Sonia from the sheriff's office and allowed them to go home.
But investigators are taking a closer look at the dynamic between mother and son.
We got married about a year and a half after we met online. He's a correctional officer, which guy in uniform, who doesn't like a guy in uniform, right? He was the whole package for me. So I'm like, where would it go wrong? A few days after the wedding, that's when the whole thing changed. Damon and I were in our own bedroom with our door shut. Sonia hated that because she couldn't hear what we were talking about. She was losing control on what was being said or being done in her home. And then there's things that Sonia would do in the home that was inappropriate. Her son's 25 years old, freshly married. She's walking around the house in her underwear. He'll be taking a shower, and she'd go into that bathroom while he's taking a shower. Damon's excuse was, oh, well, it's just the two of us and that's normal. And there'd be times when instead of just going to bed in our bed, he'd go to bed in her bed. What do you get out of that?
There is an assumption that they may have even been sexually involved with each other.
There was rumors all around Mount Vernon that they were in an incestuous relationship. I have walked up on Damon and Sonia, open mouth kissing. They played it off as if it was a natural thing, and I'm sorry, it was furthest from natural. Like that was enough right there to make me go, okay, they are definitely doing some shady stuff. That's nasty. Like, this is mama.
I had enough of Damon and Sonia's relationship. I explained to Damon we needed to have our own place, and Sonia didn't like that. I said, I'm going to go and you can join me or not, because I couldn't be in that house anymore. Damon was upset. I said, you can't run away from this. And the next thing I know is I had a machete to my throat.
We start to see a disturbing pattern emerge. Damon becomes their #1 suspect, but they need more evidence that would put him at the scene of the crime.
When Montgomery County Sheriff's Office released Damon to go home, we seized his boots. The footprint near the car was very close to the boots that Damon was wearing. We cannot say they're an exact match. That takes a laboratory. But we can say that they're close enough that a reasonable person would say, there's connection. But we also found 245 caliber spent shell casings on the right side of the road, which would lead you to believe that the shots very well came from the right side of the vehicle. That would be the passenger's side of the vehicle. What that tells us is, in all likelihood, the driver of the vehicle would have an accomplice.
And who was there with Damon?
His mother, Sonia.
Investigating officers believe at this point that they have enough to make an arrest. Sonia and Damon Bamberg were incarcerated in jail, but you need probable cause that they committed the crime to detain them.
The shoe print outside of Nikki's car seems to put Damon at the scene of the crime, but what investigators really need to seal their case is the murder weapon. And they know from the casings that it's a .45 pistol.
We went to Damon and Sonia's house. It was in disarray.
Serving a search warrant, you don't ever know what you may come across. But what they do find in the house is things that you wouldn't expect to see.
By Damon's bed
was a lock of hair in a Ziploc bag.
And it had Nikki's name on it.
Why would you have a baggie of hair from your now dead ex-wife? The label on the outside suggests it had been kept for 2 years. It's beyond weird, it's creepy.
Couldn't have her, but he had a part of her, he had her hair. That is strange. But that's not evidence.
After an exhaustive search, detectives don't find the gun or anything that ties Sonia or Damon to Nikki's murder.
But at that point, we find out some very interesting information. A .45 caliber gun was owned by the Bambergs, but not Sonia or Damon.
It was Sonia's other son, Mark Bamberg.
The question is, do we have Ron Bamberg?
I met Sonia and Damon through Mark Bamberg, the youngest brother. We were friends for about 11 and a half years. Damon hated Mark. Damon made his life such hell to the point where Mark moved out when he was 16. He couldn't be around him.
Sonia's dynamic with Mark and Damon were completely different.
Anytime Sonia would talk to Mark, it was like she was talking to a dog.
She made comments about wishing that he was more controllable and he would listen more.
You know, with most mothers, you can hear love when they speak to their children. There was none. The way they treated him like an outcast all the time, it really upset Mark a lot.
Mark, how old are you? I just turned 28.
Officer spoke to Mark Bamberg. During that conversation, they asked him if he had any guns, and he said, well, I had a .45, but it was stolen. He had a .45 caliber pistol in a truck parked on his property in the glove box. And sometime after Nikki's murder, he was looking for the pistol and it was gone.
Wish I'd noticed it missing sooner. Yeah, so what? You got gas in the truck. I forgot I had left in there. I thought I had the door locked.
The question is, who would have access to your truck?
Think about that thing. Your gun got stolen. Who was there? Damon and your mom. They were, but I didn't see them do it.
The day that Nikki was killed, his mother and brother had been over to his house while he was working in a garage on his truck. And his mother actually came over and spoke to him.
It wasn't until later that Mark discovers that his gun is missing. Now, that's quite a coincidence. But investigators need to prove that Mark's gun was actually used in Nikki's murder.
The gun had been fired into a tree at James Fowler's house.
I explained to the investigator that they were more than welcome to come look at the tree. And within a couple of hours, the tree was gone. Like, they cut the whole tree down and took it with them.
So we was able to retrieve the rounds themselves and to match up ballistically the bullets that we found inside of Nikki.
Mark, it was your gun. Kill me. Well, I had no knowledge of that. I know I didn't do it.
There was never any information developed that Mark Bamberg had anything to do with the murder of Nikki.
Mark was not involved. Sonia threw him under the bus. His gun was used, and if anybody was going to fall for the crime, it would be Mark, not her, not Damon, Mark.
I had no idea that it hurt no one. No matter what she does, she's still my mom, and I love her.
He was just a pawn to her.
Sonia and Damon Bamberg, while they were incarcerated, certainly were not in cells together. And based on their closeness, must have been a problem for them not being able to be around each other. But some of the inmates, they would pass notes back and forth between those two.
We had literally pages and pages and pages, and some of them were sickening. She would say things like, "Soon you will be in my arms again, and I will give you relief. Soon we will be able to service each other." It tells you of the mental plane that Sonia was riding. She flew way out of the realm of normalcy.
Sonia had Damon, but she wanted grandkids so that she could start all over.
They were smart enough to know that they couldn't have kids together. So I believe Damon and Sonia wanted Nikki to be a baby factory. I think they watched her, studied her, figured they could use her to get however many kids that they wanted and then try to do away with her.
The time leading up to their divorce, I said, Damon, what are you going to do if they actually don't give you custody? And he said, well, Mom and I have decided that whether or not we get custody, we are going to get those children one way or another.
Sonia Bamberg has a lot of control. During the course of our investigation, her involvement became clearer. And when the officers spoke to James Fowler During the conversation, he told them something of interest.
At a party one night, we were out at Mark Vanberg's house. We were having a bonfire, and Sonia and Damon showed up. I could tell that there was something on their mind. You could look at her eyes and just the way she talked, the way she looked at you. There was something in her that just was uneasy. What she asked me, it was weird. I mean, it really was weird. So we were all hanging around the night of the bonfire, and I was approached by Sonia. She just walked straight up and said, "I'll give you $25,000 if you kill my ex-daughter-in-law." And of course, it took me by shock, but I took it as just anger. They were, you know, somebody was angry, they said something out of anger, and that's what it was.
A Jeff Davis County mother and son are on trial for killing a woman back in 2008. Testimony started today in the trial of Damon and Sonia Bamberg.
The tension in the courtroom was so thick you could cut it with a knife. While I'm on the stand testifying, Damon is smirking at me like he's gonna get away with this.
My focus was on the evidence. I don't deal with gossip, I deal with the facts. I didn't want to get into some character here. I'm focused on, did they commit this crime? And hopefully the jury would do the right thing and provide some justice for the family. Mr. Fowler is very believable about Sonia offering him that money to kill Nikki. He indicated that he was astounded by it and left. Based on that information, officers followed up on that and were able to determine that Sonia Bamberg had purchased a $50,000 policy on Nikki Bamberg.
And guess who was the beneficiary? Sonia.
The jury understood that. Sonia Bamberg wanted Nikki out of the picture.
But we have to, at this point, prove a timeline. Surveillance footage places Damon at a convenience store at 6:01, getting ice for his hand. We was able to recreate a timeline where at 90 miles an hour, Damon and Sonia could catch up to her car, commit the crime, and then make it to Montgomery County Sheriff's Office by 6:20. It can be done. We proved it.
Damon Bamberg and his mother, Sonia Bamberg, were convicted of murdering Damon's wife. Today, a judge sentenced them both to life in prison plus 30 years.
The night that I was approached and asked to kill that young girl, I would have never imagined in a million years that the events that happened would have happened. And I'd have known, I'd have said something then. But I didn't.
I feel extremely lucky to be alive. I know that if we had continued our relationship, I would probably be buried in a graveyard.
There's no forgiving them. I don't think I can ever understand why they did that. I hope they stay in prison for the rest of their life. and I hope it's miserable.
That's a sick, twisted group of people. My sister did not deserve what she got from them. They deserve everything they got and more.
It's different growing up with your grandparents. I just try to imagine what life would be like today if she were here. I try to think about, how different everything would have been.
She needs to be remembered as the spunky, redhead, big-hearted girl that she was.
My dad's first reaction is they're going to kill me.
Why would you do something like that?
Very evil, twisted, and vile. She manipulated everyone involved.
I didn't think my mom would traffic me off like that.
I was in shock.
The first thing people remember is the sound, not the sight, the hollow echo of a phone ringing long after midnight, cutting through a quiet Sydney suburb in the winter of 1985, a sound that still seems to vibrate in the walls decades later. Because when the line was finally picked up, there was no voice on the other end, only breathing, shallow and uneven, then a click, and by morning a young woman would be gone, her name printed in block letters across the front pages. Her face frozen in a grainy photograph that would become inseparable from two words that would haunt investigators for a generation: cold case. She lived on a street where everyone knew everyone, where doors were rarely locked and arguments were loud but brief, where children rode bikes until dusk and the biggest fear was a burglary, not disappearance, not a mystery that would rot slowly under the sun of unanswered questions. But that morning police cars lined the curb, neighbors stood barefoot on driveways, and a silence settled that felt heavier than shock, because no one could explain how a person could vanish from a house that showed no signs of a struggle, no broken glass, no blood. Just a bed that looked slept in and a cup half full of tea, gone cold on the kitchen bench. Sydney in the mid-80s was restless, expanding, pulsing with optimism and excess, but beneath the neon and the coastal breeze there were shadows, and this case slipped straight into them, because the victim was ordinary, painfully ordinary, a daughter, a sister. A coworker who caught the same bus every morning and complained about the same small things, which made the disappearance feel personal, intimate, like it could happen to anyone listening. Police called it suspicious from the start, but suspicion without evidence is just noise, and in the first hours all they had were questions piling up faster than answers. Why no forced entry? Why the phone call? Why the wallet left behind but the handbag missing? Why the dog didn't bark? Why the neighbors heard nothing? Why the clock in the living room had stopped at 2:17 a.m., as if time itself had flinched. The media descended with microphones and headlines sharp enough to cut, using words like mysterious and baffling, but the detectives on the ground knew the clock was already ticking, because every hour without a lead hardens into days, days into weeks. And before you know it, a case begins to cool, the edges blur, memories soften, and witnesses stop answering calls. They canvassed the street, knocked on doors, flipped through address books, chased rumors that led nowhere, interviewed coworkers who swore she had no enemies, no secrets, nothing that could explain a disappearance so clean it looked staged, as if someone had carefully erased her from the scene. The city watched, waiting for the inevitable break, the dramatic turn that true crime stories promise, but nothing came, only a growing sense of unease as days turned into weeks and hope drained quietly out of the narrative. There were early suspects, of course, there always are: a former boyfriend with a temper and an alibi that felt rehearsed, a coworker who lingered too long at the memorial, a neighbor who owned a car similar to one reported by a single witness who later recanted. Each lead sparking a brief flare of excitement before collapsing under scrutiny, leaving behind disappointment and the creeping realization that this case was different, slippery, resistant to logic. Detectives revisited the house again and again, photographing the same walls, dusting the same surfaces, measuring the same distances, convinced that something obvious had been missed, a detail hiding in plain sight, but the house refused to talk, holding on to its secrets with the stubbornness of an accomplice. As weeks stretched on, the story shifted from breaking news to background hum, but for the family time froze completely, every knock at the door a jolt of hope followed by dread, every ringing phone a potential answer that never came. They spoke to reporters with hollow eyes, clinging to the idea that someone, somewhere, knew something, that the city itself was holding its breath, waiting to exhale the truth. Police files thickened with paperwork, statements, timelines that didn't quite align, and at the center of it all was that unanswered phone call, logged but unexplained, traced to a public phone box blocks away, wiped clean of prints, a dead end that became a symbol of the case's cruelty. A reminder that someone had been close enough to reach out, then vanish again. By the end of the year, the language changed, optimism giving way to realism, and the phrase cold case began to appear in quiet conversations, spoken reluctantly, like a diagnosis no one wanted to accept. Resources shifted, detectives were reassigned, and the case slipped into a filing cabinet labeled unresolved, but unresolved doesn't mean forgotten, not really, because every anniversary brought it back, every new technology teased the possibility of answers, every rumor reignited old wounds. The city moved on, but the case stayed, embedded in collective memory, resurfacing whenever another disappearance made headlines, a cautionary tale whispered between lines of newer tragedies. Years passed, then decades, and the file gathered dust even as Sydney transformed around it, landmarks changed, streets were renamed, but the questions remained stubbornly the same, circling the disappearance like vultures that never quite landed. Advances in forensic science promised miracles, DNA databases expanded, cold cases everywhere were being resurrected and solved, yet this one resisted revival, its evidence too thin, its trail too old, its truth buried under layers of time and silence. Every now and then, a tip would come in, a call from someone who claimed to remember something new, a face in the crowd, a car parked where it shouldn't have been, but each lead faded under investigation, leaving detectives with the same empty center they had faced in 1985. What made the case linger wasn't just the mystery, but the feeling that the answer was close, uncomfortably close, that it lived not in dark alleys or distant suburbs, but within the tight circle of people who had loved her, known her routines, understood her fears. Because statistically that's where the truth often hides, in plain sight, masked by familiarity and trust. Investigators revisited family members, gently at first, then with sharper questions as years wore on, probing for inconsistencies, for stories that shifted with retelling, but grief is messy, memory unreliable, and nothing they found was solid enough to hold in court or even in theory. By the late 90s, the case had become a ghost, referenced in training manuals, mentioned in lectures about investigative failure, a reminder that not every story ends neatly, that some crimes leave nothing behind but absence. The victim's room remained untouched for years, a shrine to a life paused mid-sentence, and the family learned to live with not knowing, a skill no one should have to master. Outside, the world debated new scandals, new fears, but this cold case remained a quiet undercurrent, a low-frequency hum that never fully faded. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, something shifted, not with a dramatic confession or a breakthrough test, but with a change in tone, a renewed interest from a new generation of detectives willing to ask old questions without the baggage of past assumptions. They reread transcripts, re-examined timelines, noticed patterns that had once seemed insignificant, and among the yellow pages and fading photographs, a thread began to emerge, thin but persistent, tied not to a stranger, but to blood, to shared history. To a secret kept so well it had survived decades without detection. It wasn't enough yet, not proof, not closure, but it was movement, the first real movement in years, and for those who had lived under the shadow of the case, it felt like the ground shifting beneath their feet. In Sydney, whispers began to circulate again, cautious at first, then louder, as reporters caught wind of renewed activity, old headlines resurfaced, and the words cold case once again sat beside the year 1985, charged now with a new, dangerous possibility. Because if the truth had been close all along, if the key had been hidden within a family, then the shock wouldn't just be about what happened, but about who knew, who stayed silent, and how easily a community can live alongside a secret without ever seeing it. The case was no longer just about a disappearance, it was about time, about trust, about the stories we tell ourselves to survive, and as investigators leaned closer to that long-buried truth, one thing became clear: whatever waited at the end of this trail would not bring peace, only answers. And sometimes answers are the most unsettling thing of all. The renewed investigation didn't begin with flashing lights or press conferences, but with a quiet meeting room, a stack of aging files spread across a scarred table, and a question that had been asked before but never pushed hard enough: who last saw her alive? And who benefited most from her silence? The detectives assigned to the revived cold case were younger than the case itself, unburdened by the assumptions that had calcified around it, and as they traced the final 48 hours of her life, they noticed how neatly everything pointed outward, toward strangers and chance. While the inner circle remained strangely untouched, shielded by grief and time. They replayed the timeline minute by minute, aligning phone records, bus schedules, work rosters, discovering small discrepancies that earlier teams had dismissed as human error, but errors don't repeat themselves with such precision, and patterns, once noticed, are hard to unsee. The anonymous phone call that had haunted the case for decades returned to the center of attention, no longer just a chilling detail but a potential signal, because the timing was wrong, placed minutes after she was believed to be asleep. And the call originated from a location that made no sense for a random prowler but perfect sense for someone who knew her habits, her vulnerabilities, her schedule down to the smallest ritual. Investigators walked the route again, counting steps, measuring sightlines, realizing that from that phone box you could watch the front of her house without being seen, could confirm the lights were off, could know she was alone. It was a vantage point, not an accident, and that realization shifted the narrative from chaos to control. Attention turned inward, toward family dynamics that had been glossed over in the early days out of sensitivity, because tragedy grants a kind of immunity, and no one wants to imagine betrayal wearing a familiar face. Old interviews were replayed, voices crackling through outdated tapes, and what once sounded like raw grief now revealed hesitation, pauses where certainty should have lived, answers that drifted just slightly from one retelling to the next. One relative, in particular, had always been present, always cooperative, always helpful, offering details unprompted, filling silences with explanations that seemed generous at the time but now felt rehearsed, as if controlling the story mattered more than uncovering the truth. The community remembered this person fondly, a pillar in the aftermath, someone who organized vigils and spoke softly to cameras, embodying resilience, and that public image had become part of the case's armor, deflecting suspicion for years. But detectives are trained to distrust armor, especially when it fits too perfectly, and as they cross-checked statements against objective data, cracks appeared, small but undeniable, like hairline fractures in glass. A claimed errand didn't align with store hours, a remembered conversation conflicted with phone logs, a supposed alibi relied heavily on memories that no one else could confirm, and suddenly the case felt less like a mystery and more like a performance that had been running uninterrupted since 1985. Forensic advancements breathed life into evidence once considered useless, fibers preserved in envelopes, fragments too small to matter in the 80s now screaming for attention under modern analysis. Results trickled in slowly, each one a careful step forward, revealing connections that were circumstantial but accumulating, stacking weight onto a theory that had once seemed unthinkable. Investigators resisted the urge to rush, knowing that cold cases collapse under haste, that patience is both weapon and shield, and as they built their case they kept it close, sharing little, allowing the outside world to believe this was just another review. Another doomed attempt to resurrect the past. Inside the family, however, tension surfaced, subtle shifts in behavior noticed by those who knew where to look, guarded conversations, sudden reluctance to engage with police, a tightening of circles that had once been open. Secrets have a gravity, pulling everything toward them, and as detectives applied pressure in interviews, asking the same questions with new emphasis, the atmosphere changed, grief giving way to defensiveness, to irritation. To slips of the tongue that hinted at knowledge no one was supposed to have. One comment, offhand and quickly corrected, suggested awareness of details never released publicly, a red flag that glowed bright against the dull background of decades-old statements. The arrest, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic in its execution. No dramatic chase, no resistance, just a knock on a familiar door and a stunned face aging rapidly under the weight of reality. News broke quickly, the headline detonating across the city: Sydney 1985 cold case closed, family secret triggers long-awaited arrest, and the shock was immediate, visceral, because this wasn't a monster pulled from the shadows but someone woven into the fabric of the story from the beginning. Neighbors who had offered casseroles and condolences now reeled, replaying memories with a new lens, wondering how close they had been to the truth without ever touching it. Interrogations unfolded behind closed doors, hours stretching into nights, and while no full confession emerged at first, inconsistencies multiplied, defenses eroded, and the narrative that had held for so long began to crumble. Investigators laid out evidence carefully, methodically, watching reactions, measuring silence, noting when eyes darted or hands trembled, because guilt announces itself in 1,000 small ways long before it speaks aloud. The suspect clung to the past, to the version of events that had protected them for decades, but time had changed the rules, and what once passed as plausible now collapsed under scrutiny. The public consumed every detail, the story evolving from disappearance to betrayal, from mystery to moral reckoning, and talkback radio buzzed with disbelief, anger, a collective sense of violation that extended beyond the victim to the entire community. How could a secret of this magnitude survive so long, so close, without detection, and what did it say about the stories people accept when they're wrapped in familiarity? The victim's face returned to screens, older now only in memory, and with it came a flood of unresolved emotion, grief resurfacing alongside a new, sharper pain, because closure doesn't heal, it clarifies, and clarity can hurt more than not knowing. Yet even as the case moved toward court, questions lingered, stubborn and unsettling, because some evidence was circumstantial, some memories irretrievably altered by time, and the truth, though closer than ever, remained partially obscured, like an object seen through fog. The arrest promised answers, but it also exposed the fragility of justice delayed, the way years can soften accountability and complicate certainty. Detectives understood this better than anyone, aware that winning in court would require navigating not just facts but decades of silence, loyalty, and fear. As proceedings loomed, the family fractured publicly, sides forming, statements issued, denials and accusations spilling into the open, the private pain of 1985 now a public spectacle, and through it all the victim remained at the center. Her absence the only constant in a story that kept changing shape. For investigators, the case had transformed from a puzzle into a mirror, reflecting uncomfortable truths about trust, proximity, and the blind spots created by love and familiarity. By the time the suspect was led away, cameras flashing, Sydney had already begun to absorb the shock, but the unease lingered, because if this secret could survive for decades within one family, it could survive anywhere, and that realization settled heavily over the city. The cold case was no longer just a file closed or an arrest made, it was a reminder that the past doesn't stay buried simply because time passes, that it waits, patient and precise, for the moment when silence finally fails. And as the story moved toward its next chapter, one thing was clear to those who had followed it from the beginning: the truth, once unearthed, would not bring the clean ending everyone craved, only a deeper, more complicated understanding of how easily darkness can hide in plain sight. Court dates appeared on calendars like grim anniversaries, circled in red ink by people who had waited decades for this moment, yet the closer the legal process crept, the heavier the atmosphere became, because justice delayed does not arrive cleanly. It arrives carrying the weight of everything it has outlived. The accused sat behind glass, older now, features worn smooth by time, and it was impossible not to feel the dissonance between the frail figure in the courtroom and the ghost of 1985 that hovered over every bench and aisle, a reminder that crimes do not age the way people do. Prosecutors spoke carefully, aware that every word would be dissected, that they were asking a jury to reach back across decades and grasp a truth that had been buried beneath routine, loyalty, and fear. They began with the basics, reconstructing the final night with forensic precision, the mundane details elevated into evidence, the half-finished cup of tea, the stopped clock, the unanswered phone call, each one reintroduced not as trivia but as threads in a tapestry of intent. Witnesses returned to the stand older, voices trembling with the strain of remembering, their recollections imperfect but emotionally charged, because memory may blur but trauma brands itself deep. Some spoke of arguments overheard, of tension dismissed at the time as family drama, others of behaviors that felt off in hindsight, the kind of details that only gain significance once the ending is known. Defense attorneys pushed back hard, reminding the court that suspicion is not proof, that time corrodes reliability, that what feels obvious now was invisible then for a reason. They argued coincidence layered upon coincidence, urged jurors to resist the seductive pull of narrative, the human desire for a villain to explain the unexplainable. And in that tension, between story and standard, the case revealed its most uncomfortable truth, that certainty is a luxury, and justice often operates in shades of probability rather than absolutes. Outside the courtroom, the city argued with itself, newspapers reviving old photographs, talk shows replaying interviews from the 80s, dissecting every frame, every pause, as if the past could be cracked open through sheer scrutiny. Friends and neighbors of the accused came forward, some in defense, describing kindness, generosity, years of normalcy that clashed violently with the image of guilt painted by prosecutors. Others distanced themselves quickly, revising memories, reframing interactions, searching for signs they might have missed, because once suspicion takes root, it spreads backward, rewriting history in its image. The victim's family sat together but apart, united by loss yet divided by belief, because when the accused shares your blood, truth becomes a battleground, loyalty weaponized against justice. Some clung to denial, insisting the arrest was a mistake, a desperate attempt to close a case too old to solve, while others saw in the evidence a grim clarity, a release from decades of wondering. Their faces told a story no transcript could capture, grief layered upon grief, the pain of loss compounded by betrayal, because discovering how someone died is one kind of agony, discovering who was responsible is another entirely. As the trial unfolded, experts testified about behavioral patterns, about how crimes within families differ, how silence is maintained not through overt threats but through subtle pressures, shared narratives, unspoken agreements that solidify over time. They spoke of the psychology of concealment, of how perpetrators often insert themselves into investigations, how proximity to the truth provides control, and listeners couldn't help but think back to those early days, to the familiar face at every vigil, the comforting words delivered to cameras. Now reframed as something far more sinister. The phone call resurfaced again and again, transformed from eerie footnote to potential linchpin, with specialists explaining how it fit a pattern of manipulation, a test to ensure conditions were right, to confirm isolation before action. Defense countered with alternate theories, random callers, technical anomalies, insisting that inference was being mistaken for fact, but the jury watched closely, absorbing not just what was said, but how it was said, how confidence faltered under cross-examination. How certain explanations strained credibility when placed alongside the full mosaic of evidence. Days blurred together, testimony stacking like sediment, and the courtroom became a pressure chamber where decades of silence were compressed into hours of argument. The accused listened, sometimes impassive, sometimes visibly shaken, their gaze drifting toward the gallery where eyes burned with accusation and disbelief. For those watching, it was impossible not to wonder how a person carries a secret for so long, whether guilt dulls with repetition or sharpens with age, whether the past becomes easier or harder to live with as time marches on. When closing arguments arrived, they landed like final blows, prosecution framing the case as one of opportunity, motive, and concealment, defense urging caution, warning against the danger of hindsight, of convicting based on what feels right rather than what is proven. The judge's instructions were meticulous, emphasizing the burden of proof, reminding jurors that sympathy, outrage, and narrative satisfaction have no place in deliberation, that their task was to weigh evidence, not emotion, even as emotion saturated every inch of the room. Deliberations stretched on, hours bleeding into days, the jury sequestered with nothing but their thoughts and the weight of decision, while outside the city waited, breath held, aware that whatever verdict emerged would echo far beyond this case. For the first time in decades, the possibility of an ending loomed, and endings are dangerous, because they force confrontation with everything that came before. When the verdict was finally read, the room stilled completely, the kind of silence that presses against the ears, and regardless of the words spoken, the impact was immediate, visible, a collective release mixed with shock, because resolution does not equal relief. Tears fell, not just for the victim, but for the years lost, for the life unlived, for the families shattered on both sides of the aisle, for a truth that arrived too late to heal cleanly. Yet even with a legal conclusion, the case refused to settle, questions lingering like aftershocks, debates reigniting about what justice means when it comes decades late, whether closure is a myth, whether understanding can ever compensate for loss. Some felt vindicated, others betrayed, and many simply felt tired, the long vigil finally over but the emotional toll still unpaid. The file was marked closed, stamped and shelved, but the story escaped its confines, embedding itself deeper into Sydney's collective consciousness, a cautionary tale whispered whenever a disappearance made the news, a reminder that danger doesn't always announce itself. That familiarity can be camouflage. The victim's name became synonymous not just with tragedy, but with endurance, with the unsettling truth that answers can hide in the spaces we trust most. Years from now, people would still talk about 1985, about how a family secret unraveled and exposed the fragility of certainty, about how a cold case can be both closed and endlessly open at the same time. And for those who lived through it, who waited, who doubted, who hoped, the case would never truly end, because its real legacy was not the verdict, but the lingering awareness that silence has a cost, and time, no matter how much passes, never fully erases the truth, it only delays the moment when it demands to be heard. After the verdict, the city tried to exhale, but the breath caught somewhere deep in its chest, because even with a legal outcome the story refused to settle into the past, instead it bled forward, seeping into conversations, classrooms, police academies, dinner tables where parents lowered their voices and warned children about trust and proximity. The courtroom emptied, but the echoes lingered, and for investigators who had lived inside the case for years, closure felt more administrative than emotional, a checkbox ticked beside a wound that never truly healed. They returned to their offices to file final reports, to condense decades of complexity into clean paragraphs, knowing full well that no document could capture the human cost of time stolen and truth delayed. The victim's house, long sold and resold, became a point of pilgrimage for true crime tourists and journalists, a quiet street once again disrupted by parked cars and whispered speculation, neighbors old and new grappling with the legacy of a crime that had branded their postcode. Some resented the attention, others felt an obligation to remember, to keep the story alive as a warning, because forgetting felt like a second disappearance. Inside the family, lines hardened, relationships shattered beyond repair, holidays canceled, names unspoken, because blood, once contaminated by betrayal, is difficult to cleanse. Psychologists weighed in, analyzing how such secrets survive, how entire systems of denial can form around a single event, reinforced by routine, by shared narratives repeated until they feel true. They spoke of cognitive dissonance, of the mind's ability to protect itself by rewriting reality, and listeners recognized pieces of themselves in those explanations, the small lies everyone tells to keep life manageable. The case became a study not just in crime, but in human behavior, in the quiet compromises people make to avoid confronting unbearable truths. For law enforcement, the cold case sparked renewed urgency, a reminder that patience paired with persistence can yield results even when odds seem impossible. Departments revisited old files, empowered by the idea that time, while corrosive, also exposes that secrets calcify and crack under pressure. Yet alongside that optimism came humility, an acknowledgement of past blind spots, of how deference to grief and familiarity can dull suspicion, how the desire to comfort can overshadow the duty to question. Training programs incorporated the case, dissecting missteps and breakthroughs, turning tragedy into instruction. Media retrospectives poured out, some thoughtful, others sensational, each framing the story through a different lens: justice delayed, betrayal within the family, the myth of closure. Critics debated the ethics of coverage, the balance between awareness and exploitation, while audiences consumed it hungrily, drawn to the unsettling proximity of evil. The victim's name trended alongside hashtags promising truth and accountability, digital echoes of the same fascination that had fueled headlines in 1985, only louder, faster, less forgiving. Amid the noise, quieter stories emerged, those of detectives who had retired carrying the weight of unsolved cases, of family members who had aged without answers, of witnesses who had second-guessed their silence for years. Some came forward after the verdict, unburdened at last, sharing details they had dismissed as irrelevant or too painful to revisit, revelations that arrived too late to change the outcome but added texture to the narrative, deepening understanding even as they reopened wounds. Each confession underscored the same truth: silence is rarely neutral, it shapes outcomes in ways no one can predict. The accused, now convicted, faded from public view, absorbed into the system, their story reduced to a case number, a mugshot, a cautionary example. But even incarceration could not contain the ripples, because accountability does not erase impact, and punishment does not restore what was taken. The victim's life remained defined by absence, by what might have been, and for those who loved her, time continued to split into before and after, anchored forever to a winter night in 1985. Anniversaries took on new meaning, no longer just markers of loss but checkpoints of reflection, opportunities to reassess what justice had delivered and what it had not. Some found solace in the verdict, a sense of validation after years of doubt, while others felt hollow, the anticipated relief failing to materialize. Closure, it turned out, was not a door that clicked shut but a corridor that stretched on, lined with unanswered questions about motive, about moments lost to secrecy, about whether intervention earlier could have altered the trajectory. The case also forced a reckoning with the concept of family, challenging the assumption that danger comes from outside, that safety is inherent in blood ties. Sociologists pointed to statistics, to patterns of domestic crime long overshadowed by stranger narratives, and the public listened differently now, primed by a story that had unfolded in their own backyard. Trust, once cracked, became something to examine rather than assume, a shift subtle but significant in a culture that prizes familiarity. In classrooms, students studied the case as history, distant yet disturbingly relatable, while teachers emphasized critical thinking, the importance of questioning even the most comfortable narratives. The cold case became a lens through which to discuss ethics, memory, and the limits of certainty, its lessons extending beyond law enforcement into the broader fabric of society. It was no longer just a crime story but a parable about time and truth, about the patience of secrets and the inevitability of their exposure. As years continued to pass, the initial shock softened into a steadier awareness, the case settling into the collective psyche as a reference point, invoked whenever another long-unsolved mystery flickered back to life. It served as both hope and warning, proof that answers can emerge and evidence that they may come at a cost no verdict can repay. The phrase Sydney 1985 cold case became shorthand for complexity, for the uncomfortable reality that resolution is rarely clean. Late at night, when the city quieted and streets echoed with distant traffic, it was easy to imagine the past pressing close, the unanswered phone call reverberating again, a reminder of how fragile certainty is, how easily routine can mask rupture. For those attuned to it, the case whispered lessons about vigilance, about listening to discomfort, about the danger of assuming we know the people closest to us. It asked a question without expecting an answer: how many other truths are waiting, patient and precise, for the moment when silence finally gives way? In the end, the cold case did what all unresolved stories do: it changed the people who carried it, reshaped institutions, recalibrated trust, and left behind a legacy more complicated than justice or injustice. It proved that time is not an antidote, only a filter, and that what survives it often does so because it was protected, intentionally or otherwise. The file may be closed, the verdict rendered, but the story lives on, not as a neat conclusion, but as a lingering presence, a shadow at the edge of certainty, reminding Sydney, and anyone who listens, that some mysteries, once exposed, never truly let go. With the headlines fading and the courtroom drama archived, the case slipped into a quieter phase, one less visible but no less charged, where consequences unfolded in private and the true weight of revelation settled over those closest to it. For the victim's family, mornings began without cameras but with the same ache, a grief reshaped rather than relieved, now carrying the sharp edges of betrayal. Conversations stalled mid-sentence, names became radioactive, and shared memories fractured into competing versions of the past, each colored by the knowledge of what had been hidden and for how long. The truth, once unearthed, refused to stay contained, forcing its way into every recollection, rewriting childhood moments, reinterpreting kindness as camouflage, turning ordinary gestures into potential acts of calculation. In police departments across New South Wales, the case prompted uncomfortable self-examination, not just about evidence missed but about instincts deferred, about how reverence for family and grief can become blinders. Senior officers addressed recruits with candor, admitting that empathy, while essential, can dull suspicion if left unchecked, and that the line between compassion and complacency is thinner than most want to believe. Training modules incorporated the case as a cautionary example, dissecting decision points where different questions might have altered the trajectory, where deference to familiarity allowed a narrative to harden unchecked. Cold case units felt the ripple effects most acutely, their phones ringing with renewed tips, their inboxes filling with emails from families long resigned to silence, now emboldened by the idea that time does not have the final word. Detectives spoke of momentum, of the psychological boost that comes when a long unsolved case breaks open, but they also warned against romanticizing resolution, reminding colleagues that each reopened file represents a wound reopened for someone else. The Sydney case became both a beacon and a burden, raising expectations that could not always be met, sharpening scrutiny on every dormant investigation. Media coverage evolved, shifting from shock to analysis, from who did it to how it happened, why it took so long, and what it revealed about collective blind spots. Podcasts and documentaries dissected the timeline, pausing on moments where intuition brushed against truth and then slid away, exploring the mechanics of silence, the subtle agreements that allow secrets to persist. Critics questioned whether the saturation risked exploiting grief, while defenders argued that sustained attention was the price of accountability, a necessary discomfort in service of learning. Within the community where the disappearance began, the case remained personal, stitched into the fabric of daily life in ways outsiders could not fully grasp. Longtime residents swapped stories, comparing memories, arguing gently over details, each convinced their recollection held some missing piece. Newer arrivals absorbed the narrative like local lore, a whispered history lesson that changed how they viewed the quiet street, the unremarkable houses, the assumption of safety. The idea that something so devastating could unfold without noise, without obvious rupture, lingered like a warning sign only visible in hindsight. The victim's memory took on new dimensions as well, her life no longer defined solely by absence but by the resilience of those who kept searching, by the questions her story forced others to ask. Memorials shifted in tone, less about mourning and more about reflection, about honoring a life while acknowledging the complexity of the truth that finally surfaced. Friends spoke of her laugh, her stubborn streak, her plans interrupted, grounding the narrative in humanity rather than spectacle, resisting the reduction of a person to a case study. Legal scholars weighed in on the implications of prosecuting decades-old crimes, debating the balance between justice and reliability, the ethics of convictions built partly on reconstructed memory. The Sydney case featured prominently in journals and conferences, cited as both a triumph of persistence and a cautionary tale about evidentiary fragility. It sparked discussions about statute limitations, about resource allocation, about the moral imperative to pursue truth even when the path is uncertain and the outcome emotionally fraught. For the convicted, life narrowed to routines dictated by the system, their story stripped of nuance in public discourse, reduced to labels that offered clarity at the cost of complexity. Appeals were filed and debated, legal avenues pursued with the same tenacity that had once protected the secret, because denial does not dissolve easily, and accountability often arrives in increments rather than absolutes. Each motion reopened debate, rekindled outrage, reminded everyone that the past, once stirred, does not settle quietly. The case also altered conversations around family loyalty, exposing the tension between protection and harm, between standing by loved ones and confronting uncomfortable truths. Counselors reported an uptick in clients grappling with inherited silence, with secrets passed down like heirlooms, heavy and rarely questioned. The story resonated beyond Sydney, touching something universal, the fear that knowing someone well enough to love them does not mean knowing them well enough to trust them completely. As months turned into years, the case's immediate intensity softened, but its lessons continued to surface in unexpected places, in policy discussions, in training rooms, in living rooms where parents explained the importance of speaking up. It became a reference point, invoked whenever a new disappearance raised familiar questions, whenever a family insisted they knew everything there was to know. The phrase family secret acquired a darker resonance, a reminder that concealment often masquerades as protection. At night, the city returned to its rhythms, lights flickering on and off, traffic humming, life continuing as it always does, but beneath the normalcy lay a recalibrated awareness, a sense that certainty is provisional, that comfort can coexist with danger without obvious signs. The unanswered phone call, once a chilling anomaly, now symbolized the moment where vigilance failed, where assumptions filled the gaps left by uncertainty. For those who had waited since 1985, the passage of time took on a new texture, marked not just by loss but by reckoning, by the slow integration of truth into identity. Some found meaning in advocacy, channeling pain into support for other families navigating the limbo of unsolved cases, while others retreated from public view, choosing privacy after years of exposure. Both responses spoke to the same reality, that survival after revelation requires adaptation, not resolution. In academic circles, the case fueled research into delayed justice, into the psychological toll of long-term ambiguity, into how communities metabolize trauma over generations. Findings echoed what many already felt intuitively, that not knowing erodes in one way, knowing erodes in another, and that neither path offers immunity from pain. The Sydney cold case became a data point in broader efforts to understand how truth, once delayed, interacts with healing. Even as the story receded from headlines, it retained a peculiar immediacy, resurfacing whenever another cold case thawed, whenever an arrest challenged assumptions about time and accountability. It served as a reminder that the past is not inert, that it waits in records and memories, in routines and rituals, ready to assert itself when conditions align. In the quiet moments, when reflection replaced reaction, the case asked a lingering question, one without an easy answer: what is the cost of silence, and who ultimately pays it? The answer, scattered across decades and lives, resisted summary, but its contours were clear, etched into a city that had learned, painfully, that some secrets endure not because they are well kept, but because they are protected by love, fear, and the human desire to believe in the familiar. And in that realization, the cold case found its enduring power, not as a closed file, but as an ongoing challenge to look closer, to listen harder, and to question what we think we know before time forces the reckoning. Time, once the enemy of the investigation, became its quiet accomplice, because as years piled up after the verdict, the story did not fade so much as it sank deeper, embedding itself into the city's instincts, altering how absence was interpreted and how certainty was weighed. Detectives who had cut their teeth on the case carried its lessons into every interview room, listening for what wasn't said, watching for the choreography of rehearsed grief, aware now that the most dangerous lies often arrive wrapped in sincerity. They spoke less about breakthroughs and more about patience, about the discipline of returning to basics, because the Sydney case had proven that complexity often masquerades as simplicity when everyone agrees not to look too closely. Behind closed doors, internal reviews continued, not for public consumption but for institutional memory, tracing how early assumptions had narrowed vision, how the narrative of a random predator had offered comfort by placing danger outside the circle of trust. Memos circulated, quiet but firm, emphasizing the need to interrogate familiarity, to treat proximity not as proof of innocence but as a factor demanding greater scrutiny. The case had cracked open an uncomfortable truth, that crimes committed close to home are harder to see precisely because they disrupt our preferred stories about safety. For the victim's siblings, life became a series of negotiations with memory, deciding which recollections to keep intact and which to examine under the harsh light of what was now known. Childhood moments replayed with altered emphasis, a tone here, a glance there, details once dismissed as inconsequential now demanding interpretation. Therapists spoke of retrospective contamination, the way new information infects old memories, blurring the line between what was and what is now believed to have been. Healing, they learned, was not about restoring the past but about constructing a future that could accommodate its fracture. Public interest waxed and waned, spiking whenever a new documentary dropped or an appeal hearing loomed, each resurgence reopening debates about guilt, fairness, and the reliability of decades-old evidence. Online forums became battlegrounds, armchair detectives dissecting transcripts, timelines, and body language, some convinced of incontrovertible guilt, others persuaded that the case represented a miscarriage of justice born of desperation to close a file. The noise was relentless, and for those closest to the case, it was exhausting, a reminder that once a story enters the public domain, it no longer belongs to the people who lived it. The appeals process itself unfolded like a slow-motion echo of the original investigation, motions filed, arguments rehearsed, claims of evidentiary weakness and procedural error tested against the record. Judges weighed the balance between finality and fairness, mindful that overturning a conviction carries consequences as profound as upholding one. Each ruling reignited emotion, relief or outrage depending on perspective, reinforcing the reality that legal closure does not equate to emotional consensus. In academic settings, the case continued to provoke inquiry, criminologists parsing the mechanics of delayed detection, psychologists examining the long-term impact of unresolved trauma, sociologists exploring how communities construct and maintain shared narratives in the face of uncertainty. Papers cited the Sydney cold case as a prism through which to view institutional inertia and cognitive bias, illustrating how early framing can constrain imagination and shape outcomes for decades. The story transcended its specifics, becoming shorthand for a category of failure and resilience intertwined. For cold case investigators elsewhere, the case offered both inspiration and caution, proof that persistence can pierce time, and a warning that success brings scrutiny, that reopening wounds demands care. Teams adopted new protocols, revisiting how families are engaged, how information is shared, how hope is balanced against realism. The Sydney file sat on shelves and servers as a touchstone, a reminder that the pursuit of truth is as much about process as outcome. The neighborhood where it began settled into a quieter normalcy, the house just another address, the street just another route to work, yet for longtime residents, the past hovered, a faint distortion in the present. They remembered the early days, the police tape, the reporters, the sense that something fundamental had broken, and even now, decades later, the memory altered how they read the ordinary, how they interpreted silence. The case had taught them that normalcy is not evidence of safety, merely a surface condition. Within the justice system, debates intensified about resources, about whether reopening old cases diverts attention from present threats, or whether the moral imperative to address past wrongs outweighs pragmatic concerns. The Sydney case was invoked in budget hearings and policy discussions, a powerful example wielded by both sides, some arguing it justified sustained investment, others cautioning against chasing ghosts at the expense of the living. The tension reflected a broader societal struggle to reconcile accountability with limitation. As anniversaries passed, commemorations evolved, less performative, more introspective, gatherings focused on remembrance rather than resolution. Candles were lit, names spoken, stories shared not for cameras but for continuity, ensuring that the victim's life remained more than a footnote in a legal saga. These moments resisted the pull of spectacle, grounding the case in humanity amid the abstractions of law and theory. The convicted supporters, fewer now but still present, clung to narratives of doubt, circulating alternative explanations, pointing to inconsistencies, arguing that the passage of time had eroded the possibility of certainty beyond repair. Their voices, often dismissed, nonetheless underscored an enduring discomfort with finality, the recognition that the legal system, like memory, is an imperfect instrument. The case thus lived in a liminal space, officially resolved yet perpetually contested, its truth accepted but never universally. In the quiet hours, when reflection eclipsed argument, those who had worked the case spoke privately about its toll, about sleepless nights and the weight of decisions made under uncertainty. They acknowledged mistakes alongside achievements, the moments where instinct faltered or courage failed, understanding that accountability applies inward as well as outward. The Sydney cold case had not just exposed a crime, it had exposed the fallibility of those tasked with uncovering it. The story's endurance reshaped how new disappearances were framed, how early assumptions were challenged, how media language was scrutinized. Reporters, aware of past missteps, approached similar cases with greater care, mindful of the power of narrative to steer public perception and, by extension, investigative focus. The phrase cold case itself took on heavier resonance, no longer a synonym for hopelessness but a reminder of unfinished responsibility. As technology advanced, new tools promised deeper insights, from enhanced DNA analysis to data modeling capable of revealing patterns invisible to the human eye. Yet the Sydney case stood as a reminder that technology is only as effective as the questions asked, that tools cannot compensate for blind spots rooted in belief. Innovation, investigators learned, must be paired with humility. The victim's story continued to ripple outward, influencing advocacy groups pushing for reforms in missing persons protocols, for earlier cross-agency collaboration, for sustained support for families navigating years of uncertainty. Her name appeared in policy briefs and training slides, a testament to how individual tragedy can catalyze systemic change, even when that change arrives too late for those directly affected. In the end, the cold case's power lay not in its resolution but in its refusal to be neatly contained, its capacity to unsettle long after the headlines faded. It lingered in the city's consciousness as a question rather than an answer, a reminder that truth, when delayed, arrives altered, and that justice, when achieved, carries shadows of what it cannot restore. Sydney moved forward, as cities do, but with a quieter vigilance, an awareness etched by decades of waiting that certainty is provisional, that familiarity can deceive, and that the past, patient and persistent, always finds a way to press itself into the present. The years after the appeals settled into a strange half-life, where the case existed everywhere and nowhere at once, resurfacing in moments of quiet rather than spectacle, in the pauses between sentences when people hesitated before saying they were sure. Investigators noticed it first in the way witnesses spoke during new cases, more cautious now, less absolute, their certainty tempered by the understanding that proximity can mislead and memory can be coached by repetition. The Sydney cold case had trained a generation to listen for drift, for the subtle slide between what someone knows and what they have decided to believe. In families across the city, the story prompted difficult conversations, the kind usually postponed indefinitely, about secrets and silence, about the cost of protecting the image of harmony at the expense of truth. Counselors described clients confronting inherited narratives, questioning why certain topics were taboo, why certain questions had never been asked. The case had given language to a discomfort many felt but couldn't name, the suspicion that love and honesty are not always aligned, that loyalty can become a shelter for harm if left unexamined. Within law enforcement, the case influenced not just procedure but culture, encouraging dissent, rewarding skepticism, making space for the uncomfortable question even when it disrupted consensus. Younger detectives were taught to challenge senior assumptions respectfully but firmly, to document uncertainty rather than smoothing it over, to revisit conclusions without treating revision as failure. The Sydney file, thick and worn, became a reminder that the most dangerous phrase in an investigation is "we already know that." Public memory of the case shifted again as time created distance from the trial, the sharp edges of outrage softening into a steadier contemplation. True crime narratives moved on, chasing fresher mysteries, but this story lingered in the background, invoked whenever someone argued that time alone solves nothing. Its endurance was not fueled by novelty but by resonance, the unsettling recognition that the conditions it revealed were not unique, that they existed quietly in countless households, unremarked until exposed. The victim's name appeared less frequently in headlines but more often in advocacy work, attached to initiatives supporting families of the missing, to reforms aimed at early intervention and sustained investigation. Her story became a touchstone, cited not to shock but to persuade, to illustrate the long arc of harm created by inaction and denial. In this way, absence transformed into influence, loss into leverage, a legacy forged not by choice but by circumstance. In academic circles, the case continued to challenge assumptions about narrative closure, prompting debates about whether society's appetite for endings distorts understanding. Scholars argued that the desire to close a case can mirror the impulse to bury discomfort, to seal off uncertainty rather than live with it responsibly. The Sydney cold case resisted that impulse, its resolution complicated by lingering doubt and divided interpretation, serving as a counterexample to the myth that answers automatically heal. For the community where it began, the story became part of the local weather, something felt rather than seen, shaping reactions to sirens and police tape, to missing posters taped to shop windows. Residents recalled how quickly routine had dissolved in 1985, how easily the extraordinary can intrude, and that memory altered how they responded to new disruptions. Vigilance, once abstract, had become personal. The convicted's family navigated a different aftermath, one marked by isolation and scrutiny, their own grief compounded by stigma. They lived with the paradox of mourning two losses, the person taken and the person convicted, both absent in different ways, and with the anger directed at them by association. Their experience underscored another uncomfortable truth exposed by the case, that crime radiates outward, touching even those who did not commit it, leaving few untouched. Media retrospectives grew rarer but deeper, focusing less on sensational details and more on process, on what the case revealed about institutional inertia and human psychology. Journalists revisited early coverage with a critical eye, acknowledging how framing had influenced perception, how the emphasis on external threats had diverted attention from uncomfortable possibilities. This self-examination was uneven but significant, a recognition that storytelling shapes reality as much as it reflects it. As technology continued to evolve, new tools offered the promise of revisiting other cold cases with fresh eyes, but the Sydney case cautioned against technological determinism, reminding investigators that data does not interpret itself. That biases can be encoded as easily as they can be challenged. The lesson was not to abandon innovation but to pair it with reflexivity, to ask not just what the evidence shows but why certain interpretations feel comfortable. In quieter moments, those who had followed the case from the beginning reflected on how their own perceptions had changed, how certainty had given way to nuance, outrage to reflection. They spoke of learning to sit with ambiguity, to accept that some questions remain partially answered, that justice, even when achieved, does not tidy the past. This shift, subtle but profound, marked the case's deepest impact, reshaping not laws or procedures alone, but the inner landscapes of those it touched. The Sydney cold case also altered how anniversaries were observed, less as reminders of a single event and more as opportunities to measure distance traveled and lessons learned. Gatherings emphasized listening, storytelling without judgment, creating spaces where complexity was allowed rather than flattened. These rituals acknowledged that remembering is an active process, one that can either reopen wounds or foster understanding depending on how it is approached. As the decades continued to stack, the story's edges blurred further, but its core remained intact, a cautionary tale about the patience of secrets and the vulnerability of trust. It lived on not through constant retelling but through its influence on decisions made elsewhere, in investigations handled differently, in questions asked sooner, in assumptions challenged earlier. In that sense, the case achieved a form of resolution beyond the courtroom, altering trajectories unseen. Late at night, when the city's noise receded to a low hum, the unanswered aspects of the case still seemed close, reminders that some truths emerge only after reshaping the lives around them. The story asked for humility, for restraint in judgment, for vigilance without paranoia, a balance difficult to maintain but essential. It suggested that the work of understanding does not end with an arrest or a verdict, but continues quietly, in how people choose to look at one another. And so the cold case endured, not as a frozen relic but as a living reference, a measure against which future uncertainties would be weighed. It taught that time reveals as much as it conceals, that familiarity can both comfort and deceive, and that the most enduring mysteries are those that force us to confront ourselves. In Sydney, long after the file was closed, the case still whispered its lesson into the city's collective ear, that silence is active, that attention is a choice, and that the past, if ignored, will find its way back, patient and exacting, until it is truly heard. As the case receded further into history, it began to function less like a story and more like a lens, quietly refracting how new tragedies were seen, how certainty was negotiated, how silence was interpreted. Detectives noticed it in briefing rooms when someone hesitated before dismissing a lead too quickly, when a junior officer pushed back against a convenient assumption, citing not evidence but the absence of it. The Sidney cold case had left behind a kind of professional muscle memory, a reflexive caution that surfaced at critical moments, altering outcomes in ways that would never be traced back to 1985 but nonetheless owed their existence to it. In the public sphere, the case subtly reshaped language, making people more precise, more wary of absolutes. The phrase "they would never do that" lost some of its power, its certainty chipped away by the reminder that familiarity is not a guarantee of innocence. Conversations about trust grew more nuanced, less idealized, acknowledging the uncomfortable truth that knowing someone deeply does not immunize against deception. The case had punctured a collective illusion, and while the hole was small, its impact was lasting. Families of the missing and murdered continued to reach out to one another, forming networks born of shared uncertainty, shared endurance. They exchanged advice not just about navigating police procedures but about surviving the long, quiet stretches where hope feels irrational yet necessary. The Sidney case was often referenced, not as a promise of resolution but as proof that persistence, even when it feels futile, can matter. For some, it offered solace; for others, it was a reminder that answers, when they come, may bring new pain rather than relief. The victim's story entered classrooms and lecture halls, used to teach not only criminology but ethics, media studies, and psychology. Students debated the responsibilities of investigators and journalists, the tension between public interest and private grief, the ways narratives harden over time. Many were struck by how ordinary the beginning had been, how easily the disappearance could have slipped past the margins of history if not for the stubborn refusal of a few to let it go. The ordinariness was the point, the reminder that extraordinary harm often emerges from unremarkable circumstances. In the digital age, fragments of the case circulated endlessly, clipped and recontextualized, sometimes stripped of nuance, sometimes expanded with speculation. Algorithms resurfaced old footage, pushing it into new feeds, exposing younger audiences to a story older than they were. Reactions varied: fascination, skepticism, empathy, fatigue, but the persistence of interest underscored something fundamental, that unresolved or belatedly resolved stories tap into a deep human need to understand causality, to locate responsibility. To believe that attention can still make a difference. The legal system continued to wrestle with the implications of delayed justice, using the case as a reference point in discussions about evidence standards and jury instruction. Judges cited it cautiously, aware of its emotional weight, while attorneys invoked it strategically, framing arguments about reliability and prejudice. The case became a touchstone in debates about reform, illustrating both the necessity and the peril of reopening the past. For the victims' friends, now older, the case existed as a quiet undertow beneath their own life stories, resurfacing at unexpected moments: a song on the radio, a street corner, a winter night. They spoke of her less often now, but when they did, it was with a clarity sharpened by time, memories distilled rather than faded. The arrest had not given them back what they lost, but it had altered the shape of their grief, replacing a question mark with something heavier, more defined. The community's relationship to the case matured, moving beyond shock towards stewardship, an understanding that remembering is a responsibility, not a spectacle. Local initiatives supported missing persons awareness, drawing on lessons learned the hard way, emphasizing early action and sustained attention. The story's influence was quiet but tangible, embedded in policy tweaks and cultural shifts that rarely made headlines but nonetheless changed lives. Within families touched indirectly by the case, conversations about secrets took on new urgency. Parents spoke more openly with children, acknowledging imperfection rather than projecting invulnerability. Therapists noted a willingness to confront difficult histories, to question long-held narratives, inspired in part by the recognition that silence, however well-intentioned, can carry unintended consequences. The Sidney cold case had become a cautionary backdrop, a reminder that transparency, while painful, can be protective. As the city continued to grow and change, the physical traces of 1985 disappeared almost entirely, buildings replaced, phone boxes removed, streets repaved. Yet the absence of those markers only amplified the story's abstract presence, its lessons no longer anchored to a place but woven into collective awareness. The lack of tangible reminders made the case easier to forget, but also easier to universalize, its themes applicable far beyond a single suburb or decade. Media creators returned to the case occasionally, not to sensationalize but to contextualize, to explore its reverberations rather than its facts. These retellings were quieter, more reflective, acknowledging uncertainty rather than promising revelation. Audiences responded differently now, less hungry for villains, more attentive to process and impact, a shift that suggested the case had altered expectations as much as outcomes. In the justice system, the case influenced how success was measured, encouraging a broader view that accounted not just for convictions but for institutional learning. Metrics expanded to include prevention, early intervention, and community trust, areas often overlooked in the rush to close files. The Sydney cold case had exposed the limitations of narrow definitions of victory, pushing for a more holistic understanding of accountability. The convicted remained a contested figure, their guilt accepted by many, questioned by some, their story invoked in arguments about fallibility and fairness. This ongoing debate, while painful for those directly affected, served as a reminder that justice operates in a human context, subject to interpretation and doubt. The case resisted simplification, refusing to resolve into a single, uncontested truth. In moments of solitude, individuals who had followed the case from afar reflected on its personal impact, on how it had changed the way they assessed risk, trust, and responsibility. Some spoke of becoming more attentive, more willing to intervene, to question, to listen. Others acknowledged a lingering unease, a sense that certainty is always provisional, that comfort can be deceptive. The case had not just informed them, it had unsettled them, and in that discomfort lay its power. As time continued its steady march, the Sydney cold case became less a chapter and more a subtext, informing reactions without announcing itself. Its lessons surfaced in policy, in practice, in personal choices made quietly and without attribution. This diffusion marked a different kind of resolution, one not confined to a verdict or a headline, but spread across countless small decisions influenced by its shadow. The city, like the people within it, learned to live with the story rather than beyond it, accepting that some events imprint themselves permanently, shaping behavior long after details fade. The case taught that attention is not just an act of investigation but of care, that listening can be preventive, that questioning can be protective. These insights, hard-earned, constituted a legacy no one had sought but many inherited. In the end, the cold case's enduring presence was less about what happened in 1985 and more about what followed, the decades of waiting, the gradual unveiling, the long aftermath of understanding. It demonstrated that truth, when delayed, does not arrive gently, but it also showed that its arrival can still matter, reshaping institutions and inner lives alike. And as Sydney continued forward, carrying both the memory and the lesson, the case remained what it had always been at its core, a reminder that vigilance is a form of care, that silence has weight, and that the past, once acknowledged, can still guide the present, even when it refuses to fully let go. By the time the arrest filtered into official records, the machinery of justice moved with deliberate caution, aware that every step would be dissected, every decision measured against 4 decades of absence and doubt. Files were reopened not with urgency but with reverence, their pages brittle, edges yellowed, the ink carrying the weight of decisions made by people long retired or long gone. Each document felt less like evidence and more like a relic, a snapshot of a moment when the future had not yet revealed how stubborn the past could be. Inside interview rooms, the air was different now. Questions were framed with restraint, pauses allowed to stretch, silence treated not as resistance but as a language of its own. Investigators understood that time alters memory, that recollection becomes layered, mixed with retellings, omissions, self-protection. They moved slowly, knowing that rushing a truth delayed for decades risked shattering it altogether. Every answer was cross-checked against context, against what had been possible, plausible, or simply ignored in 1985. The suspect's history unfolded in fragments, ordinary on the surface, marked by routines and milestones that mirrored thousands of other lives. Employment records, residential moves, family photographs, nothing that screamed danger, nothing that predicted infamy. Yet beneath that ordinariness ran a current of concealment, small inconsistencies that only gained significance in hindsight. A missing year here, an unexplained tension there, moments that once seemed trivial now glowed under renewed scrutiny. Forensic science, far more advanced than anything available at the time of the crime, was brought to bear with cautious optimism. Old samples were re-examined, techniques refined, probabilities recalculated. The results did not explode with certainty, they whispered, offering support rather than conclusion. Experts framed their findings carefully, aware that science can illuminate but not decide, that its role is to inform judgment, not replace it. As proceedings advanced, media attention intensified, drawn by the collision of past and present, by the narrative of a secret held too long finally breaching the surface. Headlines oscillated between triumph and unease, celebrating resolution while questioning its cost. Commentators debated whether justice delayed could still be justice, whether closure was a promise or an illusion. The case became a mirror, reflecting society's ambivalence toward the idea of finality. In court, the atmosphere was restrained, almost austere. There was no dramatic confession, no cinematic reveal, only the steady presentation of accumulated detail. Witnesses spoke carefully, conscious of the gravity of resurrecting old memories under oath. Some voices trembled, others remained flat, professional, each carrying a different relationship to the truth they were asked to recount. The jury listened, aware that their task was not to relive the past but to weigh it. Family members sat in silence, their presence heavy with expectation and fear. For them, the courtroom was less a venue for justice than a threshold, a place where decades of waiting might finally coalesce into something tangible. Their expressions betrayed a mix of resolve and vulnerability, a readiness to accept whatever emerged, even if it fell short of the answers they had imagined. Defense arguments leaned heavily on time, on erosion, on the impossibility of reconstructing intent from fragments scattered across decades. They spoke of memory's fragility, of contamination, of the danger of interpreting silence as guilt. Prosecution countered with persistence, with patterns, with the argument that time does not erase responsibility, only obscures it. The tension between these positions pulsed through the room, unresolved, demanding careful consideration rather than emotional release. Outside the courtroom, public discourse grew increasingly polarized. Some hailed the process as overdue accountability, a testament to perseverance and technological progress. Others worried aloud about precedent, about the risk of condemning someone on evidence stretched thin by years of absence. The debate was not abstract, it touched on fears shared by many, about vulnerability to accusation, about the permanence of the past in an age that archives everything. As testimony continued, the family secret at the heart of the case was addressed obliquely, its details shielded by legal necessity but its impact unmistakable. It was not a single revelation but a series of acknowledgments, admissions that reframed earlier assumptions. The courtroom absorbed these moments quietly, aware that secrets, once exposed, rarely resolve cleanly. They alter relationships, reputations, self-understanding, leaving behind a residue that no verdict can fully remove. The judge's instructions emphasized caution, reminding jurors of their duty to separate sympathy from evidence, to recognize both the weight of delay and the seriousness of accusation. It was a careful balancing act, an acknowledgement that the case existed at the intersection of law and emotion, history and immediacy. The law demanded clarity, the story resisted it. As deliberations began, the city held its breath, not in anticipation of drama but in recognition of significance. The outcome, whatever it might be, would ripple outward, influencing how similar cases were perceived, how resources were allocated, how hope was calibrated. This was more than a single verdict, it was a statement about the reach of accountability across time. During the waiting, those connected to the case reflected privately on what resolution meant to them. Some realized they had anchored their lives around the expectation of an answer, structuring hope and disappointment in cycles dictated by rumor and speculation. Now, with an answer imminent, they confronted an unexpected emptiness, the realization that closure does not restore what was lost, only changes the questions that remain. When the verdict was finally delivered, it arrived without flourish, spoken in measured tones that underscored the gravity of the decision. Reactions were subdued, relief mingled with sorrow, vindication tempered by awareness of irreversible damage. There was no collective exhale, no sense of release, only a quiet acknowledgement that a chapter long left open had been written, if not resolved. In the aftermath, statements were issued, carefully worded, acknowledging the endurance of those who waited and the complexity of pursuing justice across decades. Officials spoke of lessons learned, of commitment to transparency and review. Their words were earnest, but beneath them lay an understanding that no procedural reform could fully address the emotional toll exacted by prolonged uncertainty. The convicted's future became a subject of speculation, a symbol rather than an individual, their life reduced to timelines and legal terms. Discussions about punishment intersected with debates about rehabilitation, responsibility, and the meaning of accountability when so much time has passed. The case forced society to confront uncomfortable questions about proportionality and purpose within the justice system. For the victim's family, the verdict altered the landscape of memory. The narrative that had sustained them, of waiting for truth, gave way to a more complex reality, one that included confirmation alongside grief. They spoke of exhaustion rather than triumph, of gratitude tempered by loss. The future, once imagined as a place of answers, now appeared as a space requiring adjustment. As days turned into weeks, the intensity of attention faded, replaced by quieter reflection. The case receded from headlines but remained active in discourse, cited in editorials, referenced in policy discussions, invoked in conversations about trust and secrecy. Its influence persisted not through spectacle but through integration, becoming part of the framework through which similar stories would be understood. In this stage of the story, the cold case was no longer defined by absence but by consequence. The focus shifted from what had happened to what followed, from mystery to aftermath. The arrest had not ended the narrative, it had transformed it, opening new avenues of inquiry about responsibility, resilience, and the enduring impact of choices made long ago. And as Sydney absorbed this transformation, the city carried forward a story that refused to settle neatly, its echoes continuing to shape understanding long after the courtroom lights dimmed. After the verdict, time did not rush forward as many had expected. It slowed, thickened, pressing against the city like humid air that makes every movement deliberate. The legal conclusion marked an end on paper, but in living rooms, offices, and quiet streets, the case lingered, refusing to dissolve. People spoke about it in lowered voices, not out of secrecy but respect, as if the story itself demanded a softer register now that it had crossed from mystery into consequence. The police archive updated its status with a single administrative click, a word changed from unresolved to closed, yet the simplicity of that action contrasted sharply with the complexity left behind. Detectives involved in the final years of the investigation described an unexpected fatigue, not the satisfaction of completion but the weariness of having carried a weight that could never truly be set down. Some found themselves revisiting early decisions late at night, wondering how close the truth had been, how many times it had almost surfaced before slipping back into silence. Training programs quietly incorporated the case, not as a triumph but as a warning. Recruits studied it for its missed signals, its social blind spots, its over-reliance on appearances. Instructors emphasized how familiarity can anesthetize suspicion, how communities that appear safe can discourage deeper scrutiny. The Sydney case became shorthand, a reference point invoked whenever an investigation risked narrowing too quickly, a reminder that the most dangerous assumptions are often the most comfortable ones. In the neighborhood where it all began, physical traces of the past continued to disappear. Buildings were renovated, streets renamed, shopfronts replaced, yet residents described an unshakable sense that something remained embedded beneath the surface. They spoke of moments when the past intruded unexpectedly, a sudden memory triggered by a sound, a smell, a particular angle of light. The case had taught them that places remember, even when people try not to. The victim's absence was still felt in small, intimate ways. Friends who had aged into grandparents imagined the life that never unfolded, milestones unmarked, conversations never had. They described grief not as a single event but as a shifting presence, changing shape over decades, sometimes dull, sometimes sharp. The arrest did not erase that presence, it simply gave it a new contour, a different frame through which to be understood. For the convicted, the world narrowed abruptly, years compressing into legal schedules and institutional routines. Public narratives flattened their identity into a single act, a single role, erasing the complexity that once shielded them. Some observers wrestled with discomfort at this reduction, aware that accountability does not require dehumanization, yet unsure how to hold both truths at once. The case forced a reckoning with the tension between justice and compassion, a balance rarely achieved cleanly. Media analysis grew more reflective, focusing less on what happened and more on how it had been allowed to happen. Long-form pieces examined cultural attitudes of the 1980s, the reverence for privacy, the reluctance to challenge family narratives. Commentators noted how these values, often celebrated, had also provided cover for harm. The case became a lens through which to reassess nostalgia, to question which aspects of the past deserved preservation and which demanded critique. In academic settings, the story spurred renewed interest in intergenerational silence, the mechanisms by which secrets persist across decades. Researchers traced patterns of omission and euphemism, mapping how families construct shared realities that protect stability at the cost of truth. The Sydney case offered a stark example, illustrating how collective denial can function efficiently, how it can be maintained not through malice but through mutual convenience. The justice system itself faced uncomfortable introspection. Reviews acknowledged procedural limitations of the era, resource constraints, cultural biases that shaped investigative priorities. Officials spoke cautiously about reform, careful not to imply that every cold case could or should be reopened. The emphasis shifted toward discernment, toward developing criteria that balanced hope with responsibility, avoiding both complacency and overreach. Public trust, shaken and then cautiously restored, settled into a new equilibrium. Surveys showed increased confidence in cold case units but also heightened skepticism toward initial conclusions in new investigations. Citizens expressed a desire for transparency, for acknowledgement of uncertainty rather than premature closure. The Sydney case had recalibrated expectations, teaching that patience and doubt can coexist with determination. In private, those closest to the story confronted a quieter challenge: how to live without the question that had defined them for so long. Some described feeling unmoored, their identities shaped by advocacy and waiting, now lacking a focal point. Support networks shifted focus from seeking answers to rebuilding routines, from public action to personal healing. The transition was uneven, marked by moments of relief and sudden waves of disorientation. The city itself absorbed the lesson slowly, integrating it into its collective consciousness. Conversations about missing persons changed tone, less sensational, more sustained. Posters stayed up longer, tips followed through more carefully. There was a subtle but perceptible shift toward attentiveness, an understanding that vigilance is not paranoia but care extended beyond convenience. At night, when traffic thinned and the skyline dimmed, the story seemed to hover between past and present, a reminder that time does not move uniformly for everyone. For some, 1985 felt distant, almost abstract. For others, it remained immediate, a wound that had never fully closed. The arrest did not synchronize these experiences, it simply revealed their coexistence. The cold case, now officially resolved, continued to exert influence precisely because it resisted neat categorization. It was not a story of pure triumph or irreversible failure, but of complexity endured over decades. Its power lay in what it exposed rather than what it concluded, in the questions it forced into the open rather than the answers it provided. As Sydney moved forward, the case settled into a different role, no longer a headline but a reference point, a quiet benchmark against which future uncertainties would be measured. It reminded those who remembered and those who learned later that truth has a way of resurfacing, often altered by time but no less demanding. And even as life reclaimed its rhythm, the echo of that unresolved past continued to shape the city's understanding of itself, a low, persistent reminder that some stories end not with closure, but with awareness. In the months that followed, the city learned a quieter way of carrying the story, not as a spectacle but as a background hum, a low frequency that altered how certain words landed, how certain pauses were heard. Cold Case no longer sounded abstract. It carried weight now, texture, a history of rooms left undisturbed in conversations interrupted mid-sentence, of names spoken once and then avoided for years. The phrase became shorthand for a shared understanding that time is not neutral, that it shapes truth as surely as it obscures it. Those who had been children in 1985 found themselves revisiting memories they hadn't known were connected, fleeting images that had never settled into narrative before. A street cordoned off, adults speaking in coded tones, the sudden seriousness that seeped into ordinary days. Memory, they realized, had been storing fragments without context, waiting decades for meaning. The arrest did not complete those memories, it rearranged them, granting coherence without comfort. In professional circles, the case continued to circulate as an example of delayed accountability, discussed not with triumph but with caution. Prosecutors emphasized restraint, reminding colleagues that success measured only in convictions misses the deeper responsibility to minimize harm across time. Defense attorneys cited the case in arguments about evidentiary decay, warning against the seductive certainty of hindsight. Each side found in the story a validation of its principles, proof that complexity resists reduction. The victim's legacy evolved again, moving beyond advocacy into something more diffuse, a moral reference rather than a rallying cry. Her name appeared less often on banners and more often in quiet acknowledgments, in footnotes and dedications, in the unspoken awareness that someone's absence had compelled change. This shift felt appropriate to those closest to her, who had grown weary of spectacle and sought instead a steadier remembrance, one that honored life rather than loss alone. Within families affected indirectly by the case, conversations unfolded slowly, cautiously, like the reopening of a sealed room. Parents spoke to adult children about choices made under pressure, about the difference between protection and denial. Some admitted to silences they had once justified as kindness. These exchanges were uneven, sometimes painful, but they carried a sense of overdue honesty, an understanding that secrecy corrodes relationships from within. The justice system's response matured over time, moving from reflection to implementation. Cold case units received not just funding but clearer mandates, emphasizing multidisciplinary collaboration and psychological insight alongside technical expertise. Training addressed cognitive bias explicitly, encouraging investigators to document doubt as rigorously as certainty. The Sydney case lingered in these discussions, a reminder that reform is reactive as often as it is visionary. Public discourse around crime shifted in subtle ways. Sensationalism lost some of its appeal, replaced by longer-form engagement, podcasts and essays that privileged process over shock. Audiences proved receptive, perhaps because the case had taught them that truth unfolds unevenly, that patience can be as gripping as revelation. This change did not eliminate exploitation, but it introduced competition, offering alternatives that respected complexity. The city's geography absorbed the story too. Walking tours paused briefly at unremarkable corners, guides lowering their voices to mention what had happened without dramatizing it. These moments were brief, almost reluctant, but they anchored the abstract in the tangible, reminding listeners that history is embedded in everyday spaces. Passers-by often lingered afterward, absorbing the idea that ordinary places can bear extraordinary weight. For those who had worked the case across decades, retirement took on a different tone. Some described feeling unfinished, aware that while the file was closed, its influence would continue to ripple through their professional lives. They spoke of the case not as a career highlight but as a companion, something that had shaped their instincts, their skepticism, their tolerance for ambiguity. Letting go required acknowledging that some work never truly ends, it simply changes form. The convicted story receded from public view, stripped of immediacy, becoming another data point in debates about long-term incarceration and moral responsibility. Advocates argued over what justice means when so much time has elapsed, whether punishment serves retribution, deterrence, or something else entirely. The case provided no clear answers, only a framework for asking better questions, ones that resisted slogans and demanded nuance. As anniversaries passed, commemorations grew quieter still, less about marking dates and more about sustaining awareness. Small gatherings focused on listening rather than speaking, on holding space rather than issuing statements. This restraint reflected an understanding learned the hard way, that attention, once withdrawn, is difficult to restore, and that care must be continuous to be meaningful. The unresolved elements of the case remained present, acknowledged rather than denied. Investigators admitted what could not be known with certainty, what evidence had been lost, what motivations could only be inferred. This openness, rare in narratives of resolution, became one of the case's most enduring contributions. It modeled a form of honesty that allowed for imperfection without surrendering responsibility. In classrooms and lecture halls, the case found new life as a teaching tool, prompting discussions about ethics, memory, and the social construction of truth. Students grappled with the discomfort of incomplete closure, learning that the absence of tidy endings does not negate the pursuit of understanding. Many cited the case later as formative, an early lesson in complexity that resisted simplification. At the level of the individual, the story continued to work quietly, influencing decisions made far from any courtroom. A neighbor checked in more often. A teacher noticed a shift in a student's behavior sooner. A journalist hesitated before framing a narrative too neatly. These small acts, invisible and uncredited, represented the case's most meaningful legacy, proof that awareness can translate into care. As years layered over years, the cold case settled into history, not frozen but integrated, its sharpness dulled by familiarity yet never fully neutralized. It remained a point of reference, a reminder whispered rather than shouted, that truth is patient and that silence is not empty but active, shaping outcomes even when it feels like nothing is happening. In the end, the story refused the comfort of finality. The arrest had closed a legal chapter, but the narrative remained open, evolving as each generation encountered it anew. Sydney carried it forward not as a cautionary tale sealed in amber, but as a living lesson, adaptable and persistent, asking those who heard it to listen more closely, to question more gently, to remember that the past does not disappear simply because time has passed. And so the voice that had once demanded answers softened into something steadier, less urgent but no less insistent, reminding the city that some truths arrive late, altered by years of waiting, yet still capable of changing how people see one another. The cold case, resolved on paper, continued to speak in undertones, urging vigilance without fear, compassion without denial, and the courage to confront what lingers even when the headlines have moved on. Long after the verdict stopped being news, the case continued to surface in unexpected places, not announced but recognized, like a familiar scar glimpsed in passing. It appeared in the careful phrasing of officials when new disappearances were reported, in the pause before a spokesperson said there were no immediate suspects, in the deliberate refusal to promise swift answers. The city had learned, collectively and unevenly, that certainty offered too early can become its own kind of deception. In private homes, the story settled into family lore, retold with fewer details but heavier meaning. Parents used it not to frighten their children but to explain why questions matter, why discomfort should not be ignored simply because it disrupts peace. These conversations were rarely dramatic. They unfolded over dinners, during long drives, in the spaces where trust is built slowly. The case had given people permission to talk about silence as a choice, and about the cost of choosing it. For those who had lived closest to the original investigation, the passing years softened some edges while sharpening others. Regret aged differently than grief, less acute but more persistent, resurfacing during quiet moments when there was no urgency to outrun it. Retired officers described dreams where they walked familiar streets, noticing details they had once overlooked, understanding too late what they might have meant. They woke knowing these insights changed nothing, yet the mind insisted on revisiting them, rehearsing alternatives without hope of resolution. The legal system, having absorbed the immediate lessons, faced a slower reckoning. Reviews gave way to incremental changes, policies adjusted, language refined. There was no grand overhaul, no dramatic confession of failure, only a gradual acknowledgement that systems reflect the values embedded within them. The Sydney case became evidence not of individual incompetence but of collective blind spots, the kind that thrive when conformity is rewarded and dissent feels impolite. Public engagement with crime stories continued to evolve, shaped by fatigue as much as enlightenment. Audiences grew wary of narratives that promised revelation but delivered spectacle. They responded instead to restraint, to voices that admitted uncertainty and respected complexity. The case had taught them to listen for what was missing as much as for what was said, to recognize when a story was being closed prematurely for comfort rather than truth. In universities, the case took on a different life, dissected not as a singular event but as a network of decisions and omissions. Students mapped timelines, traced social pressures, analyzed media framing, discovering how easily narratives coalesce around convenience. Many were struck by how ordinary the circumstances appeared, how little in the early record suggested the scale of what would follow. The lesson was unsettling, that extraordinary harm can emerge from environments that feel entirely familiar. The victim's presence persisted in ways that resisted categorization. She existed not only in memory but in altered behavior, in the recalibration of attention. Friends spoke of noticing absence more keenly, of recognizing the shape left behind when someone is no longer there to occupy it. This awareness did not fade with time, it matured, becoming less raw but more integrated, a constant rather than a wound reopened. For the community, the case redefined what it meant to remember responsibly. Memorials avoided spectacle, favoring simplicity and continuity. There were no speeches promising that such a thing would never happen again, only acknowledgments that vigilance requires humility. The focus shifted from declaring safety to practicing it, from reassurance to attentiveness. The convicted story, stripped of immediacy, became a point of reference in broader debates about punishment and redemption. Commentators questioned whether time alters culpability, whether accountability diminishes as years accumulate. Others argued that harm does not expire, that waiting does not absolve. The case offered no resolution to these debates, only a framework for holding them without false closure. As technology advanced, the temptation to revisit the case with new tools surfaced periodically. Proposals emerged to reanalyze data, to apply emerging techniques, to seek absolute certainty where probability had sufficed. Each time, the question arose, what purpose would this serve? Investigators weighed curiosity against responsibility, aware that reopening wounds without necessity risks creating new harm. The decision to let some questions remain unanswered became an act of restraint rather than resignation. In journalism, the case influenced tone as much as content. Reporters approached anniversaries with care, avoiding the language of revelation, choosing instead to contextualize, to reflect. Some admitted that earlier coverage had prioritized momentum over accuracy, narrative over nuance. These acknowledgments were not universal, but they marked a shift, a recognition that storytelling carries power and obligation in equal measure. The city's relationship with the past grew more complex. Rather than treating history as something safely concluded, people began to see it as active, capable of resurfacing without warning. This awareness did not produce paranoia, but it did foster caution, an understanding that progress requires vigilance as well as optimism. The Sydney case became part of this consciousness, a quiet reminder embedded in institutional memory. On an individual level, the story continued to influence choices in ways rarely traced back to it explicitly. A neighbor intervened sooner. A teacher trusted their instinct. A journalist held back a headline that felt too neat. These actions accumulated invisibly, their origins diffuse, their impact unmeasured. Yet they represented the case's most enduring effect, a shift in how people attended to one another. The language surrounding cold cases changed too, less romanticized, more grounded. The phrase no longer conjured only mystery but also endurance, the labor of waiting, the toll of uncertainty. It came to signify not just unresolved crime but unresolved responsibility, a reminder that time tests commitment more than capability. As decades continued to pass, the case settled deeper into the city's fabric, less a story told than a reference felt. It surfaced in moments of hesitation, in the refusal to dismiss anomalies, in the willingness to revisit assumptions. The absence that had once demanded answers now demanded care, a different kind of response, quieter but more sustainable. In this way, the cold case remained alive, not through headlines or anniversaries, but through its influence on perception. It taught that closure is not an event but a process, uneven and incomplete, shaped by choices made long after the facts are established. It suggested that justice, when delayed, leaves a residue that must be tended, not ignored. And so the voice that once surged with urgency continued at a lower register, steady and persistent, echoing through institutions and intimate spaces alike. It asked not for resolution but for attention, not for certainty but for honesty. In Sydney, the case had moved beyond its origin, becoming less about what happened in 1985 and more about how the city chose to listen afterward, carrying forward the understanding that some stories never truly end, but instead teach us how to live with what remains. With time, the case slipped even further from public narration into something more diffuse, a shared intuition rather than a shared story. People no longer needed to recall the details to feel its presence. It surfaced instead as a reflex, a subtle recalibration of trust, a reminder that certainty should be earned slowly. In meetings and interviews, in classrooms and courtrooms, pauses grew longer, questions more precise, as if the city itself had learned to breathe differently. Those who encountered the case indirectly often described a delayed reaction, an understanding that arrived not during the headlines but afterward, when the implications settled. They spoke of realizing how easily they, too, might have accepted a comfortable explanation, how readily they might have turned away from discomfort. This recognition was unsettling, not because it implicated them in the past, but because it illuminated the present, exposing how fragile vigilance can be when routine dulls attention. The institutions shaped by the case continued to adapt, though rarely in visible ways. Policies evolved quietly, language softened, checklists expanded. Investigators learned to treat contradictions not as obstacles but as signals, to linger where narratives frayed rather than smoothing them over. The Sydney case became a reference invoked without ceremony, its lessons absorbed into practice rather than proclaimed. In the arts, the story found expression stripped of spectacle. Plays and novels inspired by the events avoided naming names, focusing instead on atmosphere, on the weight of waiting, on the corrosive intimacy of secrets kept too long. Audiences responded to this restraint, recognizing the truth embedded in suggestion rather than exposition. The case had taught that what is withheld can be as powerful as what is revealed. For families who had lived with proximity to the events, the long arc of the case reframed personal histories. Some revisited moments they had dismissed as inconsequential, now understanding how silence had been normalized, how questions had been deflected with kindness or authority. These realizations were not accusations but reckonings, acknowledgments that love does not immunize against harm, that protection can become complicity when unexamined. The language of accountability shifted subtly in public discourse. There was less appetite for villains and heroes, more tolerance for ambiguity. Commentators began to speak of responsibility as distributed rather than isolated, a network of choices rather than a single act. The Sydney case, with its decades-long trajectory, resisted simplification, forcing observers to grapple with complexity rather than resolve it prematurely. As generations turned over, younger Sydneysiders encountered the case not as news but as context, a story folded into broader conversations about justice and memory. For them, 1985 was distant, yet the implications felt immediate. They asked different questions, less about who and more about how, less about outcome and more about process. Their curiosity suggested that the case's influence had not diminished with time but transformed. In professional ethics courses, the case served as a catalyst for discussion about duty and restraint. Students debated when intervention becomes intrusion, when skepticism becomes cynicism. The absence of easy answers frustrated some and energized others, underscoring a lesson the case embodied, that ethical practice is not a destination but an ongoing negotiation. The victim's story, no longer bound to chronology, became symbolic without losing specificity. Her absence was not abstract, it was grounded in the daily adjustments made by those who had loved her, and the recalibration of futures imagined but never realized. This balance between symbol and individual proved difficult to maintain, yet it was precisely what gave the case its enduring power. Occasionally, new information surfaced, rumors or fragments that promised revelation but delivered only echoes. Each time, the response was measured, investigative interest tempered by awareness of harm. The community had learned that not every lead warrants pursuit, that curiosity must be weighed against consequence. This restraint marked a maturity born of experience rather than complacency. The city's relationship with truth grew more patient. People became less invested in definitive statements, more comfortable with provisional understanding. This shift did not signal indifference but resilience, an acceptance that some questions resist closure without undermining the pursuit of justice. The Sydney case had modeled this balance, demonstrating that endurance can coexist with integrity. In private reflections, those most affected spoke of the case as a companion rather than a burden, something that had shaped their outlook without defining it entirely. They described learning to carry uncertainty without letting it dominate, to honor memory without being trapped by it. This equilibrium was hard-won, achieved through years of adjustment rather than sudden insight. The cold case, now fully embedded in history, continued to influence decisions far removed from its origin. It appeared in grant proposals emphasizing long-term investigation, in editorial guidelines advocating caution, in community programs encouraging sustained engagement. Its presence was subtle but pervasive, evidence of a story that had transcended its particulars. As the city continued to change, absorbing new stories and shedding old ones, the case remained a quiet constant, a reminder woven into institutional memory and personal conscience alike. It did not demand attention, it rewarded it. Those who listened closely found guidance rather than answers, an invitation to remain alert to what lingers beneath the surface. In this stage of its life, the story no longer sought resolution. It existed instead as a lens, shaping how events were interpreted, how claims were evaluated, how silence was understood. The arrest had closed one chapter, but the narrative's influence extended beyond chronology, challenging each new listener to consider what might be missed when certainty comes too easily. And so the voice that once crackled with urgency now spoke in undertones, steady and persistent, reminding the city that vigilance is not a moment but a practice, that attention must be renewed continually. The Sydney cold case, long resolved in law, remained unresolved in meaning, its legacy carried forward not through repetition but through choice, asking each generation to decide how carefully it would listen when the past whispered back. As the decades stretched on, the case settled into a kind of moral sediment, layered beneath newer events but never fully buried. It emerged in moments of friction, when institutions hesitated, when families confronted uncomfortable truths, when certainty was offered too quickly. The story no longer needed to be told to be understood, its outline had become instinctive, a shared reference shaping how people weighed silence against disclosure. In civic life, the case influenced decision-making in ways that were rarely acknowledged outright. Committees debated funding priorities with a new sensitivity to time, recognizing that neglect compounds quietly. Social services adjusted protocols to account for patterns that once seemed too ordinary to flag. These shifts were incremental, uncelebrated, but they reflected a deeper change, a recognition that prevention often looks unremarkable until it fails. Those who had once followed the case obsessively found their relationship to it evolving. What had begun as fixation softened into reflection, curiosity into caution. They no longer sought new details, they sought understanding. This transition marked a maturation not just of perspective but of empathy, an awareness that stories of harm are not puzzles to be solved but lives to be respected. In the private sphere, the case continued to catalyze honesty. Families revisited old narratives, acknowledging where convenience had outweighed clarity. These conversations were rarely tidy. They involved defensiveness and grief, relief and resistance, unfolding over months rather than moments. Yet they carried a sense of repair, however incomplete, and understanding that truth, even delayed, can still recalibrate relationships. The justice system's engagement with the case entered a quieter phase, focused less on the outcome and more on stewardship. Custodians of records treated archives not as static repositories but as living documents, subject to reinterpretation and care. The Sydney file was preserved with particular attention, annotated with reflections meant for future investigators, a gesture toward continuity rather than closure. Public trust, having weathered skepticism and scrutiny, stabilized into something more conditional. Confidence was no longer automatic, it was earned through transparency and patience. Officials learned that admitting uncertainty did not weaken authority but could strengthen it, fostering collaboration rather than suspicion. The case had demonstrated that credibility survives honesty better than denial. In media, restraint became a marker of credibility. Outlets that resisted sensationalism gained loyal audiences, while those clinging to shock found diminishing returns. The Sydney case was often cited obliquely, a reminder that endurance, not immediacy, defines impact. Stories that took time to unfold, that respected ambiguity, resonated more deeply than those promising instant revelation. Education absorbed the lesson too. Teachers used the case to discuss critical thinking, not as a morality tale but as a study in complexity. Students learned to question sources, to recognize framing, to appreciate the difference between evidence and interpretation. The story's longevity made it particularly effective, demonstrating how narratives evolve and how meaning accrues over time. The victim's presence continued to shape these conversations, her absence a constant reference point. She was remembered not through exhaustive detail but through the changes her story prompted, a form of memorialization grounded in action rather than symbolism. This approach felt fitting to those who had known her, a way of honoring life without reducing it to tragedy. Occasionally, anniversaries prompted renewed attention, brief flares of interest that illuminated the case before fading again. Each time, the response was measured, acknowledging the past without reopening wounds unnecessarily. The community had learned that remembrance need not be loud to be sincere, that quiet recognition can carry equal weight. The city itself seemed to move differently, its rhythms subtly altered by the accumulation of lessons learned. Sirens no longer triggered only fear but also attentiveness. Missing posters were met with sustained concern rather than fleeting curiosity. These changes were difficult to quantify, yet they reflected a collective shift toward care as practice rather than reaction. For those who had lived through every phase, from disappearance to arrest to aftermath, the case became a marker of time, a way of measuring personal growth against public change. They spoke of aging alongside the story, of understanding it differently at each stage of life. This parallel evolution underscored the case's uniqueness. It was not static but responsive, changing as its audience changed. In policy debates, the case continued to surface as an example of why patience must be institutionalized, not left to individual endurance. Advocates argued that commitment should not depend on public interest cycles, that justice requires sustained attention even when headlines move on. The Sydney cold case lent weight to these arguments, its long arc illustrating the cost of intermittent care. As new challenges emerged, the case receded further into the background, yet its influence persisted, guiding responses to unfamiliar situations. It functioned less as a precedent than as a compass, pointing toward caution, humility, and persistence. Those who had internalized its lessons found themselves better equipped to navigate uncertainty without rushing to resolution. In this phase, the story's power lay not in revelation but in integration. It had become part of the city's ethical infrastructure, shaping norms and expectations quietly. The arrest that once dominated headlines now felt like a hinge rather than an endpoint, a moment that redirected attention rather than concluding it. And so the voice that once demanded answers continued to speak softly, reminding listeners that understanding is iterative, that vigilance must be renewed, that silence deserves scrutiny. The Sydney cold case, long after its legal conclusion, remained active in conscience and practice alike, a testament to the idea that some stories do their most important work after they are no longer told. By the time the case reached this far into the future, it no longer felt like an event that had happened so much as a condition the city had learned to live with, a quiet pressure shaping behavior without announcing itself. The shock had long since drained away, leaving behind something denser and more enduring, a seriousness that surfaced whenever people spoke about trust, about what it means to really know someone, about how easily certainty can be manufactured from habit and hope. In the routines of daily life, the influence of the case appeared in small recalibrations. A neighbor listened longer before dismissing a concern. A social worker trusted an uneasy instinct and followed up. A police officer hesitated before closing a file, aware that the absence of noise does not equal the absence of harm. None of these actions carried the drama of an arrest or a verdict, yet together they formed a quiet counterweight to the complacency that had once allowed silence to persist. Those who had once demanded closure now spoke instead about responsibility. They understood, perhaps reluctantly, that an ending does not absolve the years that preceded it. Conversations shifted away from blame toward accountability, not as punishment alone but as attentiveness extended over time. The case had stripped away the illusion that justice is a single moment, replacing it with the harder truth that justice is sustained effort, often invisible and unrewarded. In professional circles, references to the case became more implicit, woven into language rather than cited directly. Phrases like "don't assume familiarity" or "question the obvious" carried its imprint. Younger practitioners absorbed these cautions without always knowing their origin, evidence that the story had crossed from narrative into norm, shaping behavior even when its source was forgotten. The emotional landscape of those closest to the case continued to evolve. Grief, once raw and consuming, settled into something quieter, a presence that accompanied rather than overwhelmed. There were moments of unexpected lightness, guilt-tinged at first, then gradually accepted. The arrest had not healed the wound, but it had changed its shape, allowing life to grow around it rather than being defined by it. The city's relationship with memory matured as well. Instead of treating the past as a static archive, people began to see it as something interactive, responsive to how it is engaged. This understanding tempered nostalgia with skepticism, encouraging reflection rather than reverence. The Sydney case stood as proof that remembering selectively carries consequences, that what is omitted can matter as much as what is preserved. In policy discussions, the case continued to justify long-term investment over quick results. Advocates argued that endurance should be built into systems, not left to chance or individual obsession. The idea gained traction slowly, meeting resistance from those who preferred metrics and timelines, yet the case offered a counterargument grounded in lived experience. It showed that some truths require patience measured in decades, not quarters. Cultural responses to the case grew increasingly abstract, less concerned with retelling events and more interested in exploring themes. Art installations evoked absence without explanation. Essays examined silence as an active force. Audiences responded to this subtlety, perhaps because the case had taught them that understanding does not always arrive through exposition. Sometimes it emerges through recognition, a feeling that resonates without being named. For those who had once been certain they knew how the story should end, this phase brought a humbling clarity. They acknowledged how much had been invisible to them, how easily confidence had replaced curiosity. This reckoning was not self-flagellation but recalibration, a willingness to hold future judgments more lightly. The case had not just revealed a hidden truth, it had exposed the ease with which truths can be missed. Even the language of closure began to feel inadequate. People spoke instead of accommodation, of learning to coexist with unanswered questions without allowing them to dominate. The Sydney cold case had demonstrated that resolution can arrive without completeness, that certainty is not a prerequisite for responsibility. This reframing eased pressure on those still waiting for answers in other cases, offering a different model of endurance. The passage of time continued to blur details while sharpening lessons. Dates faded, names softened, but the core insight remained intact, that harm often hides behind familiarity, that silence is rarely neutral, that attention must be renewed continually. These ideas circulated quietly, shaping responses to new situations, guiding decisions made far from the original crime. In moments of reflection, people recognized that the case had changed how they listened. Not just to others, but to themselves, to the unease that arises when something feels slightly off. They learned to treat that feeling not as paranoia but as information, something worth examining rather than dismissing. This internal shift, subtle and personal, represented one of the case's most profound impacts. As the city carried on, absorbing new stories and challenges, the case remained present without demanding focus. It had become part of the background knowledge that informs judgment, a silent reference that surfaces only when needed. Its endurance lay not in repetition but in integration, in the way it shaped perception long after the headlines ended. In this stage of its life, the story offered no new revelations, no dramatic turns. Instead, it provided a steady reminder that vigilance is cumulative, built through countless small decisions rather than singular acts. The Sydney cold case had traveled far from its origin, evolving from mystery to lesson, from shock to awareness. And as that awareness settled deeper into the city's consciousness, the voice that once cried out for answers now spoke with measured insistence, urging care over certainty, patience over haste, honesty over comfort. The case no longer asked to be solved. It asked to be remembered correctly, not as an anomaly safely contained in the past, but as a living example of what happens when silence is allowed to last too long. In the end, the case did not conclude with a sound, but with a settling, like dust after a door has been shut too quickly. What remained was not quiet, exactly, but a steadiness, a new baseline against which the city measured its own attentiveness. People learned to recognize the difference between peace and avoidance, between calm earned and calm assumed. The story had trained them to hear that difference in the spaces between words. The final reports were archived, citations completed, timelines aligned, yet even in their completeness they acknowledged limits. Footnotes noted gaps. Margins carried caveats. This candor felt deliberate, an institutional admission that certainty has edges, that truth can be approached without being fully possessed. The Sydney case had earned that honesty by resisting simplification for so long. Those who had waited decades for an answer discovered that waiting itself had changed them. The question that once dominated their days no longer demanded center stage, but it had reshaped their sense of time, stretching patience, sharpening priorities. They spoke of learning how to live alongside uncertainty, how to let meaning emerge without forcing it. The arrest closed a chapter, it did not restore the years spent turning pages that led nowhere. In the city's daily rhythms, the case continued to express itself through restraint. Investigations unfolded with care. Headlines softened their claims. Conversations left room for doubt. None of this was absolute, none of it universal, but the shift was perceptible, a recalibration toward humility. Sydney had learned, through long exposure, that haste can be a kind of blindness. The victim's memory endured without spectacle, present in choices rather than ceremonies. Her name surfaced in policies drafted with patience in mind, in training sessions that emphasized listening, in quiet acknowledgments that the cost of neglect is borne by real people with unfinished lives. This was not closure, it was continuity, a commitment to carry forward what had been learned. The convicted's shadow receded, becoming less a figure of fascination and more a reminder of consequence. Debate continued, as it always would, about guilt and time and redemption. But the case had shifted the frame, encouraging a conversation less about absolutes and more about responsibility that persists beyond visibility. Accountability, it suggested, does not expire simply because attention does. As new cases emerged, each carrying its own urgency, the old story did not compete. It hovered instead, a reference felt rather than cited, shaping instincts before they formed opinions. Investigators lingered where others might have moved on. Journalists questioned angles that felt too convenient. Neighbors trusted their discomfort and spoke up. These were not tributes, they were habits, learned slowly. Years later, when the city looked back, it did not see a single moment of resolution but a long curve of adjustment. The case had altered how Sydney understood itself, how it balanced privacy with protection, how it valued patience over reassurance. It had shown that the past is not inert, that it exerts pressure until it is acknowledged, and even then continues to influence what follows. In this final phase, the story asked for nothing dramatic. No reenactment. No final reveal. It asked only for attention sustained, for the courage to remain receptive when answers arrive late and imperfect. It asked that silence be treated not as absence but as a signal, something to be examined rather than endured. And so the voice that once drove relentlessly toward an answer eased into something quieter and more enduring. It spoke not to shock but to remind, not to accuse but to caution. It carried the understanding that some cases end on paper while continuing in practice, shaping how a community listens, questions, and cares. The Sydney 1985 cold case, closed by law and reopened by conscience, did not resolve into certainty. It resolved into awareness. And in that awareness, the city found a different kind of ending, not a full stop, but a vigilance that remains, steady and watchful, long after the file is sealed, long after the echoes fade, long after the past has done what it always does when it is ignored, and returned to be heard.